Hello, and welcome to our third annual 19th Represent Summit. I'm Emily Ramshaw, the co-founder and CEO of the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. This month marks the 50th anniversary of the landmark gender discrimination law, Title IX, which states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That critical language has led to significant advances in gender equity in higher education, athletics, the workforce, and beyond. Over the next 3 days, the 19th will dive deep into Title IX, celebrating its successes while also shining a light on the work left to do. Today, we'll revisit the history and foundation of Title IX. Tomorrow, we'll consider the lasting effects the law has had on gender equity in sports and STEM. And on Friday, we'll talk about some of the most pressing challenges for gender equality today, like the pay gap, attacks on queer students, and new restrictions on reproductive rights. For our Friday conversations, we'll be gathering in person for the very first time in the 19th's history. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, we'd love to have you join us face-to-face. Visit 19thnews.org/summit for more information. We'll also be streaming that programming right here. Before we begin, I want to thank those who made this week possible, including our presenting sponsors, the Impact Seat Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Girls' Rights Project, the Lumina Foundation, and the Tory Burch Foundation. We'd also like to thank our media partner, USA Today, our academic partner, Arizona State University, and our community partner, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C. The library is where we are hosting the in-person portion of the 19th Represent Summit on Friday. It's an honor to host it in the newly renovated building, and it feels fitting to do so ahead of the upcoming Juneteenth holiday. Without further ado, let's start the conversation. We'll kick off today with a look back at the passage of Title IX and its immediate impact. We're joined by Nina Chaudhry, General Counsel and Senior Advisor for Education at the National Women's Law Center, where she works to protect the rights of women and girls to be free from sex discrimination in school. And Lee Fondakowski, head writer of the Laramie Project and an Emmy-nominated co-screenwriter for the film adaptation of the Laramie Project with HBO Films. Lee is the writer and host of Feminist Files, a new podcast exploring the history of Title IX. Suzette Hackney, national columnist at USA Today, will moderate this conversation. Suzette?
Thank you, Emily. I'm really pleased to be here today with this panel and leading this very important discussion. So let's start off. Before Title IX, women accounted for only 2% of college students participating in sports and fewer than 300,000 girls in high schools nationwide. Those are astonishing statistics, and obviously things have changed. But what has Title IX done to reach beyond athletics? And let's start with you, Lee.
Well, I come to this story both as an athlete who benefited from Title IX. I was an athlete in high school and in college, and I knew Title IX to be about women's sports and nothing more, really. And as an artist, I met a woman in my travels as an artist who was Bernie Sandler's great niece. And we were chatting, just getting to know one another. And she said, yes, my great aunt Bunny is the godmother of Title IX. And it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I said, well, your great aunt Bunny, did you know your great aunt Bunny saved my life? And she was very taken aback. And she said, how did your great aunt Bunny save my life? And I said, well, as a queer kid growing up in a small working class town, when I was able to be part of athletics, was where I found community and I could really express myself and feel at home in my life. And we started a conversation then that continued and turned into an audio series. That's really the origin story of Title IX. So we know it as being related to sports, but really it started off as a bill for, against discrimination in hiring and admission practices, right? So my expertise is in this pocket of time between 1969 and 1975, where behind the scenes in Washington, the women skillfully and strategically laid the groundwork for the bill to be passed in 1972 and implemented in 1975. So its application at the time when it was passed, nobody even thought about athletics. It was about hiring and admission practices. And sexual harassment, sexual assault were not even terms that existed in 1972 when it was passed. So we see its application over the generations really transforming. And one of the people I interviewed, Wendy Mink, who's the daughter of Patsy Takimoto Mink, said Title IX is not a guarantee, it's a promise. And it's for up to each generation to apply Title IX and to see how broad its application can be.
That's so interesting. Nina, what are your thoughts on that? How has this application worked in the 80s, 90s and beyond? Like, it's obviously something that has grown and changed over time. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so just to build a little bit on what Lee said first, Title IX, when it was passed, was intended to be a broad law that really opened the doors to education for women and girls across this country. And we know that Patsy Mink herself was denied admission to medical school because of quotas. There were quotas at the time for women to enter colleges and graduate schools. And frankly, none of us would be sitting here today without Title IX, because those doors to education really were broken down because of this law and opened. And since the law was passed, as Lee said, athletics was not mentioned at all when it was passed. It only became an issue several years later when the regulations were coming into effect in 1975. We've seen the law evolve in many ways, right? So the law, again, talks about, it prohibits discrimination in any education program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. That means that it applies to all of our public schools across the country, to colleges and universities, and that it prohibits all kinds of discrimination. So we've seen the law, for instance, at the Law Center, we brought a case in the late 90s all the way to the Supreme Court on behalf of a 5th grade girl named LaShonda Davis, who was being sexually harassed by her classmate. And at the time, the courts were all over the place, some saying you could sue under Title IX for this kind of student-on-student sexual harassment, and others saying you could not. And in bringing that case to the Supreme Court, we were able to secure a win for students where the Supreme Court did say, in fact, yes, this is the kind of discrimination that if schools do not address, that is a problem under Title IX, and that Title IX prohibits that because it affects their ability to get their education. So we've seen the law evolve to include teacher-student sexual harassment, student-on-student sexual harassment. Pregnant and parenting students are protected from discrimination against Title IX. There was actually guidance in the late 70s that talked about that. And yet, sadly, today, we still see many pregnant students being pushed out of school, being discriminated against in various ways, not being allowed to make up assignments, not being given bigger desks if they need them. A whole lot of discrimination that we still need to work on.
Why do you think, and I want to ask both of you this, why do you think that we connect Title IX so closely to athletics when there truly is, just as you've described, this very broad initiative? Lee, I'll start with you.
I would say it's because the dramatist in me wants to answer this from the point of view of a dramatist. It's because the NCAA was such a formidable obstacle, right? Like they weren't paying attention at all when they were holding hearings around the initial proposals. They weren't paying attention. They were like, there's no discrimination. We know what you're talking about. You women in Washington, like whatever you're doing, we don't care, right? And as soon as it was passed and they realized the full weight of the law, the full implications of the law, they came out fighting. And this is predominantly, football. You could just say that, like football, revenue producing sport in most colleges, which is like an institution in colleges across America. And they were such a formidable obstacle and they had so much power and the women kept fighting them back. And so I think that narrative kind of cemented around that time because it really was a David and Goliath story to get to not have Title IX weakened and diluted in those crucial implementation years. And women have gone out there and, done incredible things in athletics. So I think that's the other part of it too. The women's soccer team, it's like iconic. Brandy Chastain, goal to win the World Cup, and like the whole country went crazy. The whole world went crazy, right? So it kind of also cemented that Title IX narrative around sports.
And I just will add that I think sports is still an area where sex stereotypes run rampant, where people really have still, even 50 years after Title IX, some very different ideas about what women and girls should and should not do. And we see that in recent years, even when women ski jumpers wanted to get their sport added to the Olympics, in comments talking about how there are concerns about women doing this because it could hurt their reproductive system. These are arguments that from the beginning of Title IX have been used to sort of deny women and girls opportunities to play sports. There were concerns that if they ran the full court in basketball, their uteruses could literally fall out. These are arguments that have been made in courts, in the public sphere. And I think there really just are still these notions of what women should and shouldn't do, despite the millions and millions of amazing female athletes we now have the privilege to watch. So I think some of those stereotypes run deep.
It's interesting to me because obviously we know that there have been broadened athletic opportunities for girls and women in athletics. But Title IX has not served as that perfect backstop. We have a case just last year during the NCAA basketball playoffs tournament in Indianapolis, where we saw photos of the women's basketball team training facility as compared to the men's, and it was abysmal. Why do these challenges still exist?
It's a really good question. And I think, yes, that was shocking, but also not shocking, right? For those of us who have worked in this field for decades now, we hear regularly from parents, from students, from athletes across the country about these kinds of disparities. And I will say at the K-12 level, where I've done a lot of work over the years on behalf of parents and students, one of the most common complaints we hear is about the inequities between softball and baseball, because they're so visible. You can see that we hear complaints all the time about boys having baseball fields that look like minor league baseball stadiums, and girls having fields with no bleachers, with no dugouts, with divots all over the field. I think it's unfortunate, but I think part of the problem is that we don't have enough enforcement of the law. Resources are limited, and while the government can investigate some schools, it certainly can't investigate all of them. So we definitely need more resources for enforcement by the federal government, by states. And then we need greater awareness still among all of us to know that there is this law that is a powerful tool in fighting inequities that girls and women are still facing. So these kinds of summits and journalists and everybody who's raising awareness of Title IX, the students who have done incredible work over the years, we need to get that message out.
Yeah, and I think it also that brings up a larger question of well, what is equity, right? What does it really mean? And I think a lot of my research shows that, okay, so women and girls were begrudgingly given these things. And then the mentality was, well, what more do you want? Right? Okay, you have a field. All right, maybe it's in the back and it has divots and there's mosquito infested. That was the field that I played on when I was growing up. But we gave it to you. What more do you want? Right? And I think that whole mentality needs to shift, where it's like, no, you're not giving this to us, right? Like, this should be fair. Like down the middle, even Steven, it's not like you hold all the power and then you're giving us these little crumbs. So I think it's a paradigm shift that I think is actually gradually taking place, but it definitely is slow progress. When Title IX was passed, Bunny Sandler said that she thought that there would be no sexism in universities right away, within a year. right? And then as she traveled around the country, she said, okay, 5 years. And as she continued to travel around the country, she said, okay, 10 years. And then, as she was dying, she said, not in my lifetime, right? But someday. And I think we're there. We're still in the someday phase.
When we saw those crazy photos of the disparity in those training facilities, one of the reasons it got so much attention is because the players themselves were very outspoken and posting about it on social media and such. And so women are feeling empowered to use their voices as well. But there's a law, right? There are laws around this. And so how can, using that specific example of what happened in Indianapolis, how does Title IX address that? What do we do, Nina? What do you do in situations like that?
Well, we educate, students about their rights, first of all. That's most important. And clearly, young women are getting that message. And thank goodness for social media, which now has the ability to share those images across the country and across the world. Students can file complaints with the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. But we typically, frankly, always advise students first to go to their schools and ask for, and demand change. And that can be hard to do. So we totally recognize that. Often it's easier in a group if you can get a group of students or parents together and go ask your school to make the changes that, they need to make. Sometimes that works. Sometimes, folks have gone to the media and shown a spotlight on the disparities, and that really prompts some change. And then often, as a last resort, students and parents have had to sue to get their rights enforced. And certainly we've represented a number of students over the years. I've worked with high schoolers, middle schoolers, all the way through the college level. But a variety of techniques and strategies can work to make change. So, litigation is always the last resort. But as you said, there is a law, and that law protects the rights of students to get what's fair.
There's a story from the Yale crew team. I hope I'm not going to get all the details wrong, but the Yale crew team, I know this part to be factual. The men had showers in their locker rooms. The women did not have showers. The women had to wait on the bus in the cold in their wet clothes while the men took showers. And one day they had enough of it, so they marched into the dean's office. They took off their clothes. They're staying there in their jog bras in front of the dean, like, this is us, do something about this. And within short order, they had showers too, right? So it was a very dramatic moment of social action, but they kind of laid bare the inequity and the narrative around, like, okay, like, why is it okay in anybody's world for us to be shivering on the bus while the men take hot showers? This has to stop. So that rise to action.
And the professional, I was just going to say, the professional women athletes, the U.S. women's soccer team, the WNBA players, those women have so effectively used their platforms and are such role models for the younger women and girls who are coming up behind them, because, they've had to fight, as we've seen publicly and in court for many years, the women's soccer team, to finally get equal pay. But they're using their voices and their power to affect change is so important as well.
And they're also normalizing speaking up. Like it's not like it's some kind of taboo thing to do an action or to stand up for yourself. So I think they're normalizing it as role models, which I think is incredible. Like, yes, you can speak up. Like you just speak up.
Yeah.
Lee, as a former athlete, in a different time, right?
A different time, yeah. Yeah, I think I was told my uterus would fall out if I played full court basketball, but I did it anyway because I loved basketball. But I do remember hearing that.
I played basketball in high school too, and I wasn't very good, but I played, and thanks to Title IX.
Well, I just wonder, we're talking about these powerful women, student athletes, female athletes, and using their voice. But Lee, you couldn't use your voice back in the day. Yes, you got to play sports, but it was a very different time. how do you look at what today's athletes are doing, what today's women athletes are doing, and girls in fact?
I think it's incredible. It's been incredible to watch. Like I played college sports also. I played soccer in college, and there was never a thought. I mean, I wasn't good enough to become a professional athlete, but there was not even a thought that you could become a professional athlete. So even, one of my roommates in colleges who was an incredible basketball player, varsity basketball player, and on a full academic scholarship for playing basketball, and just the rigor, she'd get up at 5 a.m. and go to practice and then do all her schoolwork. And then, I was in awe of the discipline and the devotion, both to the sport and to her academic studies. But it was unthinkable that you could go pro or have a lifelong career doing what you loved, right? So to watch that happen actually fairly rapidly, right? That professional sports, not just the beginning. Like I remember when the New York Liberty first started to play, like they were bumped. This is a little bit tangential, but related. They were bumped from Madison Square Garden because of an event, and they had to play basketball at Radio City Music Hall, which is where the Rockettes play, right? So it was like the ball would like go flying and into the audience. It just didn't make any sense at all, right? But to just sort of watch the arc of that evolution too, where no, these women are formidable, and this sport is viable, commercially viable, and people care and will watch because people love competitive sport, right? It's just sort of in our blood. So I don't know, as a kid, just like a scrappy athlete and loving to play, and then watching it become like really like a dignified profession has been great to observe in my lifetime.
And I just want to say that, I think one of the great legacies of Title IX is the fact that we have so many young women and, speaking out, because whether it's, I had a client years ago who her high school didn't have a locker room for her to change in. She played field hockey at a local school, and she knew about Title IX. She came to us. She was doing a project. We helped her talk to her school, and essentially they took an existing locker room that boys were using and split it down the middle and gave half to girls, which they should have done a long time ago. But because of her advocacy and her speaking up, she made that change for everybody at her school. She went on to law school and is probably an amazing advocate. But, I think whether it's her or the young women who protested and made a lot of noise and demanded change around sexual harassment on college campuses, they achieved real and lasting change, in policies, in the ways schools have to do things. And we are currently waiting for this administration to issue revised rules on Title IX that will hopefully undo some of the damage that was done by Betsy DeVos on the sexual harassment front and made it harder for students to come forward.
Let's use the remaining time that we have left to talk about that hope and the future of Title IX and the revisions and such that you spoke about. We talked about the U.S. soccer teams and the women players who fought for equal pay to their male counterparts. But what are the other conversations moving forward surrounding Title IX that we need to have these discussions and keep moving the needle and having these conversations? What's the future looking like?
Well, I think there's a lot of work still to be done. So on this 50th anniversary, I know we're all celebrating the great progress that we've made, but we are also looking forward to the work that remains. And I think, to pick up on the sexual harassment point that I was making, we are waiting for new rules coming out of the Biden administration, Department of Education, that will hopefully restore protections for students on, at all levels of education, so that it's not so hard for them to come forward. And harassment, no matter where it happens, when it affects the educational environment, is addressed. We're also hoping to have rules that state clearly that LGBTQ plus students are protected on, in schools. That's definitely an area that we need to continue to move forward on. There are unfortunately so many attacks, in particular against trans students across the country, that are just heartbreaking. And, I mentioned pregnant and parenting students earlier. That's an area that still needs work. We see that women are still not as represented as we'd like to see in STEM fields, in certain, high wage, high skill fields. And that goes for women and men, right? Making sure that they have the full panoply of options that they should have, and not be limited by barriers to entry in fields or sex stereotypes that say, oh, men shouldn't do this or women shouldn't do this. We still see vestiges of that kind of discrimination, unfortunately. So those are a few things that I am hopeful we will continue to address moving forward, as well as athletics, of course, where we still see an unlevel playing field for sure.
Yeah, and I would say my hope comes from young people. I think they're so smart and so dynamic. And, studying the origin story of Title IX and this phrase on the basis of sex, right? Which is kind of a foreign term to young people, right? They don't think about sex in terms of gender, right? So it's like the conversation around gender and how it's expanding for young people. And how Title IX will begin to address trans rights and things down the road. I find it very hopeful that, back to Wendy Minks, it's not a guarantee, it's a promise, right? But it has to be applied. I have a lot of faith in young people to make those applications and to stand up for themselves and their peers also. Right. So that's one thing that I think is really changed for me, is like, as a queer person growing up, it was like, we just had to kind of be quiet and in hiding. And then when we came out, we were just with each other. Right. But young people today they don't see things like that anymore. It's like everyone's at the table. And there's a new allyship that has occurred that I think bodes well for the application of Title IX into the future.
How do we, just piggybacking off of that though, how do we educate the parents out there who, yes, I would agree that the young folks get it, right, for the most part. The parents are challenging. There's so much talk about, I don't want my daughter in the same locker room or my son. How do we keep spreading the message about this equity, which is what we're all fighting for?
Well, I'll take that on. I mean, for me, when my students started identifying themselves with they them pronouns, I was tripped up by it at first. I was like, okay, they them pronouns, and it took a while, right, to kind of get it and to understand where they were coming from with that. I today take they them pronouns, right? So it's like I learned from them that I can claim that space for myself. And it is a little awkward. We can say it's grammatically incorrect, or we haven't done it like that, so we're not going to want to change. But it actually doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much to shift. So I think in terms of how do we educate, like, I think as soon the more that people are themselves, just by virtue of being themselves, others are educated.
Yeah, and I agree totally with that. And also, with facts and with information, because I think, in a number of these challenges that we've seen, the facts are not supporting what people are saying. And so, there isn't a threat in locker rooms. And I think we have to fight misinformation with the truth and with facts. And I know a number of friends and parents who have children who have transitioned. And yes, I think it can be hard for parents, for sure. But I think, you love your children, you let the children lead you. And hopefully we all learn, as Lee is saying. And I think exposure also to, people who may be different than you is so important. And unfortunately, I think that doesn't happen, in all parts of our country, and people sort of hole up often in their little enclaves. But we need to sort of broaden our worlds and fight the false narratives with the truth.
I love that reference to data and information, because that was the beginning. That was the real origin story of Title IX, is Bunny Sandler putting an ad in the Saturday Review of Literature saying, if you've been discriminated against, contact me, and being flooded with letters from women across the country. And then she took all those letters and she turned it into data and information that was 200 pages thick. And then they gathered more information. So like the whole basis, the bedrock of Title IX was information, hard facts, hard data. So I love just paying homage to that fact.
Absolutely. And it's a fight that has continued, right? And so we have seen what happened, right, back in the 70s, but look at how far we have come. And I would like to leave it on that positive note, is that we have made great strides, right? And sure, there's plenty work left to do, but we keep fighting every day. And I think you two are in that fight, and we appreciate you. And if you have any final words, that would be great. This has been so informative. I can't thank you enough for your participation.
Thank you. I will say, just go tell everybody you know about Title IX. The more we spread the word that there's this powerful law, the better. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and as Nina said, we're all sitting here today because of Title IX. And it's been great talking with you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzette. U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren is next on our lineup today. But first, Cheryl Conti, CEO of the Impact Seat Foundation, our presenting sponsor, is here to say a few words. A quick reminder that while sponsors help keep the 19th events free for our audience to attend, they play no part in the programming of these conversations.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Conti, CEO of the Impact Seat Foundation, a proud sponsor of the 2022 19th Represents Hybrid Summit. At the Impact Seat Foundation, we are creating a world in which women, especially women of color, can succeed as business leaders. Today, we're reflecting together on the last 50 years of Title IX, which has paved the way for equality in education and beyond. I'm honored to introduce a champion of women's rights and human rights, Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's a personal hero of mine, and rumor has it, there's a treasured picture of us together in my living room. Allegedly. Senator Warren has dedicated her life to expanding the spectrum of opportunity for all Americans. Her visionary policies and forward stances on the central issues of our time have been a beacon of light for others to follow. She remains unwavering in her commitment to achieving a more equitable, peaceful, and prosperous future for our nation. In spite of the turmoil through which we are living, she persists nevertheless, emboldening the rest of us to emulate her example. After last month's harrowing news about the possible overturning of Roe v. Wade, America is beyond fortunate to have leaders like Senator Warren advocating on our collective behalf. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the one and only Senator Elizabeth Warren, and thank you from the Impact Seat Foundation.
Thanks, Cheryl, for the introduction to our next interview. Senator Warren, who worked for years as an educator, will discuss her firsthand experience teaching in a pre-Title IX era and the ways this key piece of policy has transformed public education and more. Erin Haynes, the 19's editor-at-large, will interview the senator. Erin?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you so much for joining us, Senator Warren.
Delighted to be here, Erin. Let's have some fun.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, your lived experience really does sit at the intersection of so much of what we're going to be talking about this week as we reflect on the legacy of Title IX and, frankly, the work left undone. So let's begin.
Okay.
So I want to start by reminding people that before you were a senator, you were an educator. You taught elementary school as a young woman, and then you spent 3 decades in academia as a law professor. I think you were in law school when your daughter was a toddler. So,
that's right.
I mean, I bring all this up to say that you really lived and worked in a time before Title IX. So talk to us about what that was like and what you see has changed since the passage of Title IX.
So I think of Title IX, the changes are, we understand the obvious ones, that before Title IX, about 10% of women participated in college sports. After Title IX, it's about 40% of women. But I'd like to think about kind of the ripple effect of that. When I first went off to college, I got a scholarship. It was a debate scholarship. And I used to describe it as the girls' equivalent of an athletic scholarship, because there were no athletic scholarships for women, at least not any that I knew about. And the only way that females had any chance to get any kind of help getting into college or guidance in college was maybe if you happen to be a debater, and there aren't so many of those, and a few did it on academics. But other than that, sports, we have to remember, also meant a lot of people got invited into college, got recruited into college, got told about college so they could come, and part of it was to participate in sports. And to expand that, the way it's been expanded, has been a part of expanding opportunities for women across the board. So when you think about this change in time, think about Title IX, but intersect it with the other changes that are happening right at the same time. Roe versus Wade, right? We're just about on the 50th anniversary, if it's wherever we're going to be with Roe versus Wade. These notions that women are in fact full participants in the college experience, in education, in making decisions about their own bodies, and that in turn has to do with the kind of money they can earn, the kind of career opportunities that are open to them. I see all these pieces tied together, and Title IX is it's like shooting off the rockets at the beginning, the fireworks to get the thing started.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Title IX is such an important part of kind of that latest chapter in the struggle for gender equality in this country. Yep. Well, I wonder, I mean, how did that experience, kind of coming of age at that time, how did that inform how you approach your role now as senator, particularly in terms of how it influences the policy that you're trying to create?
So it's so interesting. Think about where we are now, Erica. It's like we've come so far, but we have so far to go. So I have people say to me, wow, you now serve in the Senate when there are 20 women in the Senate. And I'm like, 2 cheers, because I get it. Even when I first came here 10 years ago, there were 3 of us who were elected who were numbers 10, 11, and 12 to be in the Senate. On the other hand, last I heard, we're 50% of the population, and we surely got at least 50% of the brains. So you would like to think maybe we'd be 50% of the people who are helping to run things.
Yeah.
I see all of this as we're moving, and we're definitely moving. And to deny that is wrong, but it is so hotly contested now. The things that I thought by now we will take for granted, that women are equal participants and treated with equal dignity. I thought, okay, that's bedrock. Let's count on that and let's build on that in terms of realistic opportunity. And then I read something like this leaked opinion on Roe versus Wade, and I said, whoa, wait a minute. These folks, these extremists in the Supreme Court want to do something that the overwhelming majority of Americans do not want them to do. They want to take away the protection of Roe, and they really want to treat women as second-class citizens, women whose bodies should be monitored and invaded by an aggressive government that will determine what kind of birth control you can use, whether or not someone will be forced to carry a pregnancy to term, somebody, including a 12-year-old who's been molested, including a mama who's already working 3 jobs to try to support the children she has. So things that I thought were settled, because we won those battles for Title IX, we won the battle for Roe versus Wade, we won some equal pay battles legislatively, not in practicality, but I thought, okay, that's our foundation that we we can work from and we all agree on. But it turns out that's really hotly contested. And that puts us in a lot scarier place than we used to be in.
Yeah, quite a fragile foundation, I think we're
Yep.
finding out on in so many areas. And so that makes me want to ask you, I mean, what lessons do you think, though, that Title IX holds for how we as a democracy can think about policy as a vehicle to gender equity?
Oh, so it's a great question because, Ayanna Pressley and I always use the same expression. Policy is my love language. If you get to talk about policy, policy is about how we make real change. And just go back to it, what I was talking about a minute ago. We changed the laws around Title IX and look at the powerful difference it made. 4 times as many women participate now in sports when they're in college, but watch how the proportion of women has gone up. So it's 4 times as large a proportion of a much larger group of people who now go to college. And that is a profound difference in everything we do, in the determination of our lives, in the things that are open to us. When I was a little girl, if you were female, you were supposed to get married and have children.
Yeah.
And the 2 groups that were permitted to do something else were teachers and nurses. And that was it. There was just, those possibilities just were not open. I see Title IX as when we begin to talk as a whole country and say, you know what? We got a lot of talent over there. We got a lot of women who are smart and thoughtful and engaged. And we want to hear from them. And we want to make it possible to hear from them. And this is a part of how we make that happen. And so I think of Title IX as that moment, and it shows us you do good policy, you make big differences. Let me give you an example. Right now, I want to see universal child care. We are really the only developed country that is not making the investment in our children. The only wealthy country that does not provide paid family leave and universal child care. Universal child care. Right now, we're all talking about inflation, right? What can we do to bring down inflation? And I'm worried. I'm worried about the costs that families face. But let me make 2 points related to that. The first one is, one way you bring down inflation is you increase supply. You increase the supply of goods and services, then prices can come down. Okay, we all got that, right? We had an economist come in and testify at a subcommittee hearing I did a few weeks back. And he pointed out that if we had universal child care, there'd be about 5.1 million more people in the workforce.
Wow.
People who can't go in the workforce today, mostly mamas, some daddies, because they can't get adequate, affordable childcare. So we put 5 million more people to work, producing more goods, offering more services. And this is a good way to both bring down inflation and, he testified, increase GDP by about a point, which makes us all richer, right? Makes us a richer nation. And then I'll mention the second one. It also would mean families with young children that are trying to make a go of it would have one of their biggest expenses relieved.
Yeah.
So they're not trying to pay the equivalent of a college tuition every year in order to have a 3-year-old in childcare so that they can go to work. So here we have this problem in front of us about inflation, the economy, about family costs. And one of the most obvious ways to deal with that is let's look at what would help families, what would help women have more opportunities in the workplace, and that's childcare. That's just plain old policy 101. We pass policies like that, then women have more opportunities. That promise of equality in citizenship becomes closer to a reality.
Yeah. Yeah, that I mean, frankly, is a barrier to women's full participation, right, in our society, in the workplace. And we certainly at the 19th have recognized that inflation is gendered, but you've given us one more way to think about that. So thank you for mentioning that. So I want to move on to some other topics that are not specific to Title IX, but that you've also, I mean, you're bringing up that are central to the conversation around gender equity. You mentioned Roe. I mean, as of now, we still don't have a Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, but I know that you're already taking action in the wake of that leaked decision. Can you just talk to our audience about the new legislation that you're proposing around data privacy, and also what you and some of your Senate colleagues are asking the administration to do ahead of what you anticipate that decision to ultimately say when the ruling does come down?
Good. So let me start and say the first thing I want to do is we need to make Roe the law of the land. We don't need the Supreme Court to do that. Supreme Court does not get the final word. The final word is in Congress if Congress will step up. So we need to make Roe the law of the land. And that means we need to fight back against the Republicans who 100% of them are blocking us on this. Right now in the Senate, every Democrat voted in favor of a bill to make Roe the law. Every Republican voted against it. Second thing we need to do is we need to go after these companies that are selling locational information and other personally identifying information that would permit anybody with a credit card to buy the data to track a woman's movements, to see who was in the parking lot at the Planned Parenthood clinic for 4 hours, or worse yet, who left Texas and showed up in California and then showed up at a Planned Parenthood clinic. So I think it's critical that we put a stop to that, and put a stop to that right now. I'm willing to do it by statute, but I'm also trying to involve the administration more in doing this. The third thing is to ask the administration to use all of their tools. You know, we'll fight the Republicans on the ground here in the Senate, but the administration has its own tools, and in particular, medication abortion right now has a lot of restrictions on it that are not medically driven, they're politically driven. If we took those politically driven restrictions off, for example, who is it that's allowed to dispense the drug rather than just a general pharmacist? It has to be a pharmacist who's taken extra certification. Okay. There's no medical reason for this. Pharmacists do all kinds of drug dispensing. So if we can make medication abortion levelly available, that is available in the same way other kinds of prescription drugs are available, that can help make sure that access is available to those who need it. And so I want us to be pushing on all fronts, legislative and administrative.
Yeah. Well, of course, I have to ask you about student loan debt.
Oh, you better.
The administration recently did announce that nearly $6 billion in federal debt is going to be forgiven for those victims of Corinthian colleges, but we know that the total U.S. student loan debt is nearly something like $1.75 trillion, I believe. What can you say about what is possible on student loan debt? What are you continuing to hear from voters, and what are you continuing to push for?
So let me just start with a little bit about why we need to do this. The first point I want to make is kind of who you get in your head about who's going to be helped. Keep in mind that 42% of the people who are dealing with student loan debt don't have college diploma. Some of them are folks who never were intending to go to college. They went to get a technical degree, or they went to beauty school and then discovered, either before they got the license or after, it's not enough to cover the costs. So they're earning like a high school grad, but they're having to deal with what is still student loan debt. So that's part of it. Part of it too are people who tried, and God bless them. You know, it just, for some people it didn't work out. Got pregnant, you were already working 3 jobs and you couldn't manage the jobs and try to go to school. Your mom got sick. You move to another town, and think about that. That's 4 out of every 10 people with student loan debt who earn like a high school grad and are paying on college debt, and it's killing them. The second part is to remember about the group that does go to college, and even those who have diplomas, it's not easy sailing for many of those who borrow money. So for example, African Americans borrow more money to go to school because their families have less to help them. So they borrow more money to go to school, borrow more money when they're in school, and then have a harder time paying it off when they get out of school. Black women are they're carrying the biggest amount of student loan debt of any demographic group that you look at. I'll give you just one stat that just really tears at my heart. 20 years after people have left college, 20 years that they've been out there paying, the average white borrower owes about 6% of what they originally borrowed. And you just want to say, well, damn, 20 years you've been making these payments and you're still not paid off? That's a lot, but the end is in sight.
Right.
20 years out, the average Black borrower owes 95% of what they originally borrowed.
My goodness. No, that is staggering.
It looks like you're going to just be paying forever and forever and forever.
Yeah.
So if the president canceled $50,000 of student loan debt, he would, with that single act, help close the Black-white wealth gap for people with student loan debt by 27 points. Did the same thing, by the way, for the Latino white wealth gap. There is nothing the president of the United States could do all by himself that would have such a powerful impact on the racial wealth gap. And that is why, for the NAACP, for example, this is now their number one priority, wanting to get this through. But it's a chance, again, I look at this in terms of opportunity, and opportunity across the board. We beat down some of this student loan debt so people have a chance. They have a chance to move out of mom's house. They have a chance to save up for a down payment for a home. They have a chance to start a small business. They have a chance for some of them to start a family. They have a chance to put aside a little money for their own retirements. That these are folks who are trying to build a stable future, and canceling a big chunk of student loan debt would be a way of saying, as a country, we want to invest in people who are trying to get an education, and we want to give them some help. And by the way, $50,000 of student loan debt, $50,000, would mean that about 85% of the people with student loan debt, it'd be gone. They'd be done. And that would have a pretty powerful impact on a lot of people. So I'm all in. And in case you're listening, Mr. President, this is a great program. And today would be a great day to cancel $50,000 of student loan debt. We sure do need it.
Well, listen, last thing I want to ask you about, just to circle back a little bit to lawmaking. We know there were several parts of the proposed Build Back Better legislation that would have addressed gender inequities, but that legislation stalled. What can you tell our audience about the current state of Build Back Better? Are we close to a deal? Are any of the priorities that could impact women and marginalized Americans still in the bill? And what's the window for action? The midterms are looming. Are we talking about a matter of weeks to get something done here in Congress?
So look, there's ongoing negotiations, and what's in and what's out on any given day just keeps moving around. So you have to understand that, because it means two really important things. The first thing that it means is that we know what we need to do. We know what the parts are. That's the good thing about having been in this fight over Build Back Better. We've really laid out how to do universal child care. We've really laid out how to do home and community-based care. We've laid out how to do the child tax credit. We have laid out how to do family paid leave, family paid medical leave. And we've also laid out how to pay for it. You know how I am about let's do the corporate taxes, 15% minimum tax for these giant corporations that report billions in profits and pay nothing in taxes. And yes, Amazon, I'm looking at you. But others, 55 corporations last year reported more than $1 billion in profits and paid little or zero in taxes. So minimum tax would help pay for this. Minimum international tax would help pay for it. So we've got ways to make all of this work. And what that should mean is, yeah, I'm going to keep pushing right here in the Senate. You bet. I'm always keep those cards and letters coming in because it's important to get this done. But listen to the second part. When you say we're coming up on the election in November, understand this. The only reason we haven't passed this stuff, the principal reason is because we don't have a single Republican who will stand with us on any of this. Not one Republican. So we're going to have a chance come November to make our voices heard on Roe, to make our voices heard on universal child care, to make our voices heard on tax fairness so that it isn't hardworking middle-class families that are paying all the costs, but that we actually get those at the top to pay something to help support building a stronger country with more opportunity. But for all of that to happen, we got to be willing to turn out come November. And now, in June, is the time to help a candidate. Now is the time to call up some woman who's running for Congress, call up some senator who's or person who's running for the United States Senate. Call up somebody who's running for governor or for your state legislature who cares about the same issues you care about. Because now is the moment when volunteering, when saying I could give you a couple of hours a week, I could make some phone calls, I could knock on doors, I could come in and fold pamphlets for you. Now is the moment when it makes a difference. And if we care about these policy issues, these fabulous policies that we could pass that could make the kind of difference that Title IX made, if we care about the kinds of things like protecting Roe versus Wade, not giving the Supreme Court the last word, but giving us the last word, then we've got to start that battle right now. We got to show up every day between now and Election Day in November. And then in Election Day in November, we got to elect the people who are going to get this done.
Well, Senator Warren, I want to thank you for such a robust discussion. Title IX is all about full participation in our society. And so talking to you about these issues, absolutely, this is part of that conversation. So we'll be sure to stay tuned on the path forward on all of these issues. But in the meantime, take care and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Existing structures are hard to change. And when you get the pushback and people saying, oh, we've always done it this way, what you want to do is then set up a set of transparencies so that people can see exactly what's going on and so they can make real judgments based on facts. I'm very, very proud of that bill, of that law, because it was a step, it was a brick in the wall of the liberation of women. And anytime you do something like that, that makes a legislative career worthwhile. And are there still challenges? Absolutely. Are people still lying on the forms? Of course they are. But I think the place to start is to celebrate the victory. And once you've done that, then to say, okay, what else is possible? And not be satisfied with that. To say, you know, this is what the last generation did, we can go one better.
As we head into the rest of the day's programming, I hope you'll help us spread the word by sharing what you're learning with the hashtag 19th Represents. Next, we'll hear about the practical application of Title IX on college campuses, including what it looks like to adapt to different rules and expectations set by new presidential administrations. Nadra Niddle, the 19's education reporter, will talk with Jessica White, director of Howard University's Title IX office. Over to you, Nadra.
Thanks, Emily. And thank you, Jessica, for taking the time to be with us to discuss Title IX and its 50-year anniversary. One of the questions I would like to start out asking you is just how long have you been in your role at Howard, and what's your experience dealing with Title IX issues?
Thank you. So I am new to Howard. I started January of 2022 with Howard University, and it has been an amazing opportunity. As the Title IX director, I serve at the capacity as Title IX coordinator. And so whether it's taking a look at our policy, knowing that we have some revisions possible in the near future coming, offering services and resources and supportive measures to our community, making sure that we're keeping campus safe and our community can access their educational opportunities, whether it be through employment or as a student. I take great pride in making sure that the institution that I am growing to love continues to make sure that all of its members of its community are free from gender harassment and discrimination.
Well, thanks for explaining that, and congratulations on your relatively new role at Howard. You mentioned some potential revisions that might be made to Title IX, which many advocates and students even have been waiting to hear from the Biden administration. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Title IX regulations might change from one presidential administration to another. And, the previous administration raised a lot of concerns with their Title IX regulations. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, are there any revisions or any approach that you're hoping the Biden administration makes that the Trump administration did not?
Well, I think I've been doing Title IX work or gender equity, sexual violence work on college campuses for many years now. And we've seen it take many different forms of fashion depending on the administration. And with each new regulation that's come out, you can feel the pendulum swinging. You can see the attention given to complainants, respondents, and my thought process, my hope is that the more regulations come out, the less the pendulum is swinging. So we're hopefully going to land somewhere in the center where we are thinking about fairness and equity to all members of our community, regardless of their role, because at the end of the day, everyone is a member of our community. We want them to be able to access those educational opportunities. That's what Title IX is about. And so given this, the anticipated new guidance, I'm very curious to see what they will include. I'm very curious to see what they will address or make some changes from the previous administration. One of the things that, if I had my ear to the ground, I believe that LGBT issues is going to be a major component of the new guidance. It'll be very interesting to see how that is applied. Biden had, early in his term in office said that gender equity as well as sexual orientation will be included under Title IX. And so how do we do that? That's what we're looking to the guidance to see, is how do we make sure that it's implemented in a fair way for all members of our community. There's been some case law out there to supplement the guidance that'll also inform our practice. And so it's actually looking at it from multiple different angles to ensure that all members of our community can reap the benefits of Title IX, can reap the benefits that our educational opportunity, our educational campuses are providing our students, our faculty, our staff, our third-party vendors, everyone.
Right, and you touched on a few things that I would love to follow up on. So you mentioned, Biden's potential approach to LGBTQ plus students. And that's something, just me interviewing people as I've written stories about Title IX, that's come up, that they would like more protections for LGBTQ students, especially for transgender students. And then the other thing that I've heard from advocates is that they want it to be easier for students to report sexual misconduct and they feel that during the Trump administration, it became harder for students to do so. So can you touch on either or both of those, what you expect or what your hopes might be, or even, the Howard community overall, what their hopes might be regarding, sexual misconduct and protections for LGBTQ plus students?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to understand is that when we talk about Title IX, that's a federal guidance that applies to institutions of higher learning. Each institution then develops their policies based on the guidance that's given from the Department of Education. And so it's a struggle sometimes for to apply the guidance to all campuses across. We all have different personalities, we all have different traits. And so how do you take one document and make it applicable to all campuses across the nation? And so that's where the Title IX coordinator and the Title IX office and our stakeholders become so important. We're the ones who are then able to interpret these documents and fine tune them in a way that really helps benefit our campus. So at Howard, I think one of the things that I really appreciate is the community aspect of the work that we do. Being able to partner and call on members across the campus really allows us to be able to develop that community, develop that opportunity for our campus community to know who we are, know that we are safe, know that we are looking to make sure that our community can provide the resources needed to be able to help keep our students successful, help keep our faculty and staff successful. And so in that interpretation of the guidance, I think we all have an opportunity to really set the tone on our campuses, to be able to help our community know what's important to us, how to access the reporting. One of the things to think about in terms of making it easier for students to report, what are the different modalities that we have for reporting? Is beyond just online reporting. Can you stop by the office? What is the phone number easily posted? There's so many different things that can be done to create a welcoming opportunity for those who are looking to seek assistance. And it's beyond the Title IX office. That's why we have confidential reporters on campus. That's why we have mandatory reporters on campus. What does their training look like? How are they responding when our community comes to them in order to create a welcoming environment? So making sure it's not just the responsibility of the Title IX office, it's top down and across the board, a campus-wide initiative.
And thank you for explaining that as well. Now, Howard is a historically Black college. And one of my questions for you, I don't know the types of institutions you've served at prior to Howard, but do you think there are any unique concerns about Title IX at HBCUs?
That's a very interesting question in that regardless of the type of institution, we're going to apply the policy fairly. We're going to apply it according to the regulations. So on one hand, we're going to be very similar to other institutions. But on the other hand, boy, do we have some unique opportunities at an HBCU as well. When you think about the people who are showing up in the process, when you think about the variety of cultures and expectations, that's going to present unique opportunities as well. So you might have various cultures who might not be as willing to report or might not be willing to engage in different processes or procedures. You may have cultures that may not be as willing to engage in mental health services, which are going to be so critical for healing and being able to move forward. And so how we provide these services is really important to ensure the success of our community. I think another area that I love about HBCUs is our traditions. Mm-hmm. We have so many traditions, and if you were to walk across on campus, and talk with, let's say, students, you're going to get many different answers about what their favorite traditions are. Traditions don't always align well with changing regulations. And so one of the things that I would take a look at with HBCUs is how are we able to adapt? If we are steeped in traditions, how are we able to adapt to the changing regulations? And can our policies, our procedures change and evolve with the regulations, as well as the resources needed to be able to meet those expectations? And so sometimes we need to be creative. We need to also make sure we're meeting the needs of our specific population to be able to ensure success. So that's where that individual nature on each campus also becomes so important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, when Title IX comes up, the first thing that many people think about are sports. My work is focused on sexual misconduct, but sports is one of the top issues associated with it. And I know just recently now, student athletes in college may now get corporate sponsorships. And I've already had heard some concerns that this is something that may be more likely to benefit men as opposed to women athletes. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Let me get out my magic crystal ball. I do think that that is going to be an ongoing nature as we start to implement the updated rules and regulations in athletics. At this point, I'm not quite sure how that's going to look and how that'll play out, but a big piece of the work of Title IX is to be able to track the trends that are happening on campus. So to be able to take a look at your programs and your activities and see how gender is being played out, or if there's any inequities or disparities between different genders. And so being able to work with athletics, to be able to work with the various components, stakeholders of your institution, to be able to take a look at that, it's going to be a key piece of what we do. And so it's still early, but data will come out and we'll be able to see what that looks like. And that's also going to be different campus to campus. You know, some campuses, certain sports are more popular than others. And so being able to know your campus, to be able to see what's happening is going to be really important. And so I would encourage those who are implementing Title IX to really be proactive about the gathering that data, to be able to see, so that we are getting ahead of this and not letting the gender inequities succumb to our campus.
Yeah. Now we're celebrating the fact that Title IX has been around for 50 years. And although it hasn't always operated in the way that students and activists would like, many people would argue it has resulted in major gains for women, and now likely for LGBTQ plus students and others. And I was wondering if you could discuss this. How has Title IX, you know, benefited many of these marginalized students on campus?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I enjoy about the LGBTQ plus conversation and how Title IX applies to that is it's not just a single issue. It's not like you wave a magic wand and poof, they have rights. There's complexities too. There's many different components. There's the usage of pronouns. And when we think about freedom of speech, academic freedom, when we think about the safety that comes along with the usage of pronouns, it's a very complex issue. And so I'm excited to see the progress that comes along with these conversations. I think other areas where Title IX has able to make a lot of gains, and an area that we don't talk about often or is a little not as well known within Title IX is pregnancy and parenting. That is covered under Title IX. And when we think about the responsibilities that come along with it, and historically, pregnancy has been something that has been used as an excuse to deny access to promotions, to raises, whatever the case may be. And so to be able to say, no, there's protection under Title IX if someone becomes pregnant or chooses to become a parent. And I think it's very important to mention, it's not women, it's all genders when we start talking about parenting and well, really all of these issues. I think the conversation about how does Title IX apply to men is something that is overlooked because it's seen as a women's issue, which, I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of women that's impacted, but men are also impacted. And so it's about equity under Title IX. So as we are looking at the services that Title IX is providing, are we applying it to women? Or are we applying it across the board, regardless of what someone is born at birth, regardless of what someone may identify as at the moment, or regardless of what someone may be perceived as their gender? How are the rules, the policies being applied across the board? You mentioned sexual violence. That's something that, you know, we deal with a lot in the Title IX office, but I think it's also important to take a look at how does this apply to other policies and programs, procedures that are happening across the campus. I think that's something that we will need to continue to keep our finger on the pulse of as we are looking at the services that we're providing, and we'll see how that's impacted by the updated guidance.
Yeah, and you must be psychic because pregnant and parenting students was going to be my next question, but I think you already answered that. The fact that early on, Title IX was a way to protect those students from being pushed out of school. Do you think things have gotten better for that student population now, or are there still struggles that Title IX needs to address for the pregnant and parenting population?
Good question. I think if we can get students connected to our office, we've definitely made progress, and being able to advocate for them in the classroom, whether it be, various accommodations or breastfeeding or time off to be able to meet their medical needs. I would say one of our challenges is getting students connected to our office for pregnancy-related accommodations or pregnancy-related needs. There's been so much attention given to the Title IX around sexual violence that when students hear Title IX, they don't automatically think pregnancy, but we definitely are providing those services. And so encouraging our community to utilize us is a benefit. So I do think there's been progress. I think in that area, there will be more as well.
Yeah. Now, in the 50 years that Title IX has been around, the student population has changed pretty dramatically in the sense that, women make up the largest population of students. I know that's the case at Howard as well, where I think women make up around 70% of students, definitely more than 2/3 of the student population. So has that changed things, the fact that there are so many, women students now?
I think that as we are looking at the demographics of women in higher education, we are definitely still, Title IX is definitely still needed. There's definitely different beliefs around what women can accomplish or the role of women in the classroom, what women can wear, and different gender stereotypes that come from society and culture. And those will continue to play out in the classroom, even though we are seeing an increase in women. And that's where Title IX comes into play. So while we might have more women on campus, the services that we provide are still needed, are still relevant, and making sure that the classroom or the campus community as a whole remains a safe, welcoming environment.
Yeah. And as we come to a close, I want you to get your crystal ball out one more time. And I'd like to hear you discuss 50 years from now. How do you hope college campuses look in terms of Title IX and gender and other forms of equity?
Yeah, well, I think in 50 years from now, the amount of regulations coming out with each administration around sexual violence will have slowed. We will have gotten a handle on how to provide the best services possible to those who may have experienced sexual or dating violence. I believe that we will continue to take a look at as different generations come forward, how they use technology, how they show up in the classroom will continue to change. And so as Title IX, we will need to remain relevant to the times. We'll need to remain relevant to whatever our students are bringing to us in order to keep them safe. If I think about even when I was a student, I didn't know what a TikTok was. And so in 50 years from now, Lord only knows what the latest form of technology or social media. And so we'll need to make sure that we are adjusting with the times. I also think that we will continue to evolve in terms of taking a look at the services we offer across campus above and beyond sexual misconduct. So if you think about single-sex camps, or how the gender breakdown is in admissions or services that we offer across campus, the various programs that we offer, how are we able to meet the needs of different populations? So for instance, a popular one is women in STEM. How are we able to meet the needs of those populations and yet still ensure that the services we're providing in order to meet those needs are equitable across genders? That is a very complex and difficult question that we are grappling with. We have continued to see various levels of engagement and case law around those issues. And so I think we will continue to see those type of policies evolve over the next 50 years or so.
Great. Well, thank you so much for providing your insights in this discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jessica and Nadra. Now let's take a little break. I'm excited to introduce Grammy-nominated singer, songwriter, and mental health advocate, Jewel, who will be sharing her own mindfulness tips with us today and throughout the summit.
Meditation seems really mysterious, but at its core, it's very simple. It's just the willingness to be consciously present. That's it. So I use my breath to keep me present, and I count my breaths. So one breath in is 1, out is 2, in is 3, out is 4. If you get lost in thoughts, like for me, I'll start thinking about the things I have to do, and all of a sudden I'm realizing, oh, I'm thinking. As soon as you notice that, just come back to your breath. Whatever number you think you're on doesn't really matter. The number isn't the most important part. It's just coming back to that present moment. So they've been able to scientifically prove that when you realize you're distracted and you come back to the present moment, that builds a neural pathway. And they've learned that in 8 weeks, you can actually grow frontal lobes, grow folds in your frontal lobe, which is incredible. And you can shrink your amygdala, where anxiety lives. So you can grow the part that experiences joy and reason, and you can shrink the part that causes you to experience anxiety. So again, winning is just when you get lost in thought, going, oh, I got lost in thought, and coming back to your breath. That builds the new neural pathway. Sometimes when you sit and meditate, you'll be anxious and you'll notice how anxious you are. That's okay. It's just a willingness to be present with whatever is. Sometimes when I sit down to meditate, I didn't realize I was as scared or as sad as I was, and I'll actually cry. And then I feel a lot better. Other times I just feel so relaxed because my whole system dilates, which everybody's does. So I just thought we would start with this. It's really simple. We're just going to take 5 breaths.
Thank you, Jewel. Before we get into the next conversation, I want to tell you about a special giveaway happening only during the summit. Our membership manager, Serena Henderson, has curated a gift basket with Jewel's latest album, some special edition 19th swag, a couple of our favorite books, and more. Everyone who signs up for one of our 3 free newsletters over the course of the summit is entered to win. You can find the sign-up form at 19thnews.org/giveaway or scan the QR code on screen. We'll announce and email the 2 lucky winners near the end of our summit on Friday. 1 virtual attendee and 1 in-person attendee will be randomly selected. Now, on to our next conversation. A lesser known but incredibly important aspect of Title IX is the protection it provides students and faculty members from being fired or otherwise punished for getting pregnant or having a child. This protection has enabled generations of people who might otherwise be discriminated against to pursue higher education and careers. Joining us to talk about this are Jessica Lee, Senior Staff Attorney at the Center for Work-Life Law and Director of the Center's Pregnant Scholar Initiative, a legal resource center for pregnant and parenting students. Nicole Lynn Lewis, founder and CEO of Generation Hope, an organization that supports pregnant and parenting teens in college along with their children. And Benita Miller, Executive Director of Powerful Families, Powerful Communities. She founded the Brooklyn Young Mothers Collective, which provides legal information, advocacy training, and social services support for pregnant teens and young mothers. Miller is among 9 people the American Civil Liberties Union credits for shaping Title IX. Sarah Luderman, caregiving reporter at the 19th, will moderate this conversation. Sarah?
Thank you so much. So to start off, I'd like to ask each of our panelists how you got interested in working in the area of Title IX and pregnancy protection. If we can start with Jessica.
Thanks. So my mom was a pregnant student. All of my earliest memories are on campus. I was one of those fortunate students, student parents, children who was able to make it into campus childcare. And I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't had those experiences and that support from my mom's institution. So I take this very personally because I see a lot of the supports that she had just aren't available for other student parents. And really that needs to change. So I started this work because of her and I stay in it because it's so amazing to be able to work with so many pregnant and parenting students who are frankly on the verge of getting pushed out of their education.
Yeah, I love hearing that story and that perspective of a child, of a student parent. I came into this work because I was a student parent myself. I was a teen mother. I got pregnant my senior year of high school and I started college with a nearly 3-month-old baby. So I was a new mom, I was a new college student, kind of all of those things happening at one time. It was extremely intimidating. I was not at an institution that had any sort of supports for pregnant or parenting students, and also was at a predominantly white institution where I was one of very few Black students on campus as well. And so my college journey was extremely difficult. I had periods of homelessness. I had times where, you have to pick between a diaper and baby wipes and a textbook for class. And it was extremely isolating. And I certainly had experiences where I ran into professors or different people at the institution who were not supportive of me being a mom and didn't understand my experiences and weren't accommodating when I had a challenge that came up. And so took all of that, and now I'm an advocate for parenting college students through my organization, Generation Hope. And it's just the most rewarding work, and I'm so thankful to be a part of it.
Hi, so piggybacking on both of what you've said, I come to this work because of my parents. My parents were pushed out of school in the early 1970s, and then just a deep desire to support teen parents and to pretty much avoid child welfare intervention. And then I happened upon their school environment, and that struck me as having a causal connection between lifelong involvement with systems that, first of all, diminish you sometimes as your humanity, but also leave you yearning for more and living in poverty. So those were the things that motivated me to get more deeply connected to Title IX legislation and work.
So both college students and high school students are impacted by Title IX. I think I'm going to start off with college students. I think most people think about college students as being sort of young recent high school grads who are pretty far from the responsibilities of parenting. But it's actually a significant number of university students have children or are pregnant. So I was wondering if you could speak to how many university students are pregnant, how many are raising children, what do their lives look like?
So it's funny when I go and talk to people who are working in higher ed every day about the number of parenting college students out there, their jaws drop on the floor. And these are, college administrators, their faculty and staff, professors. And it's nearly 5 million students across the country who are parenting and juggling, going to school and working, and all of the responsibilities that come with that. And when I say that number, I also think about the millions of other students, other parents who would enroll in college or who enrolled in college at some point, but had to stop out because the system is not set up for them to succeed. There aren't accommodations, there aren't supports, and these are really environments that don't value and validate parenting. And so it's a huge population, both those who are enrolled and those who would be enrolled if we could really transform higher ed to be more supportive of student parents. When we look at the population, we know that population, they're more likely to be students of color. They're more likely to be students with low income. They're more likely to be students who are first generation college students. When we're looking at race specifically, it's almost half of all Black female undergraduate students across the country who are parenting and going to school. So again, significant population, and they're really at the intersection of all of these different groups that we often talk about in silos. Again, first generation college students or students with low income, and parenting college students are really at the center of so many of those intersections, right? And so it's really important as we're talking about equity in education and in higher ed that we are talking about parenting college students. And unfortunately, that's not happening enough across the country.
And to answer your question about the pregnant college students, frankly, we don't know. Nobody has solid numbers on the number of students who are having children in higher ed. So we can track them at individual points in time, and we see they put it on their financial aid application, for example. Something's changed in their family, but we don't know how many pregnant students were there. And of course, we also, on many campuses, just don't have good data on how many student parents are on that particular campus. And so if you don't know how many there are, you don't know who they are, how are these campuses supporting them? And it's, I think, really important thinking about a lot of these pregnant students. They need often accommodations, they need to protect their health on campus. They, just like anyone else, need that campus housing. And we're seeing again and again that they are denied those basic accommodations. All too often, they're not able to take off any time when they do give birth. It's very challenging for a lot of these students to come back. And so we know the deck is stacked against student parents in terms of housing, food security, all of the basic needs challenges that a lot of these families are facing. But we're seeing, even before the child is born, these tremendous barriers to pregnant students continuing in their education.
So Title IX also protects pregnant high school students.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the demographics of these students? Benita?
I mean, the demographics speak, it mirrors what you see at the post-secondary level, in that well, depending on where you are situated in the country, there are largely more lower income young women or young people who become pregnant and parenting. I think what's interesting that the comments about we don't know about what's happening on the college campuses, we know even less about what's happening at the high school level, because oftentimes those are the young people or the young women that you see pushed out of school systems or disappear from school systems on their own because of the stigma attached to being a young parent. So, while the numbers are coming down in terms of pregnancy rates among younger women, there still seems to be a lack of visibility and supports for them available at the high school level. And there is no real research happening to talk about what are the best practices and models out there to help support pregnant and parenting students, whether they are in, if you will, segregated settings where specialized programs or mainstreamed with their other peers.
When you say segregated settings, do you mean programs that are specifically for pregnant people?
Yes, because I think that the reason why I call them segregated settings is because school districts largely and heavily rely on them when they want to push out young people, young women, I should say young people necessarily, but young women, and they encourage them to go to those settings. And sometimes those settings don't offer enough of the curriculum to help them matriculate toward graduation or even stay on the same pace as their peers in the school setting that they left. And they don't always have childcare available to them postpartum.
And they don't always have a choice going into that program. You know, sometimes it's presented as a choice, but in reality, we know they are being pushed out of the regular classroom and into a setting that's not meeting their needs.
Right, absolutely. And the difficulty is because there are very few scholars that look at, scholars or advocates who look at the the secondary level. It's very hard to kind of get a clear picture on it. What happened in New York City was very specific in that we had enough information anecdotally from young women as well as school administrators around. We had 4 programs for pregnant students and they were strongly encouraged to go there. We also had at the time, a maternity rule that was embedded in the chancellor's regulations that encouraged young women to take maternity leave without real supports around it. So what was intended to be a good thing actually created another avenue or mechanism to facilitate young women leaving their educational settings.
So what are some of the protections that are available to pregnant high school students?
It varies. That's what it's not standardized across systems because it really depends. Like I'm in New Jersey and New Jersey has regional schools. So local school districts can strongly encourage young women to go to a regional school or young parents. It's interesting because it rings out as this very neutral language about it being for young parents, these settings. But we know that pregnancy is not largely visible, but is visible with young women. So they are the ones that they're more burdened around identifying childcare, making sure they keep up with their education. And what also puts them at greater risk is the possibility that they might interact with child welfare officials. In that something about their own perceived, if they're missing school, what might be considered ed neglect, and would subject their parents and then them to a child welfare investigation, or how they are managing that early parenting, which we know is a stressful time under the best circumstances, but that also puts a spotlight on them, which also influences whether they disappear from systems.
So it seems like there's a little bit more available to pregnant college students. What is available to? Oh,
Arguably, yes.
Nicole is.
I mean, when you're a minor, you're subject to a lot of different, whether it's parental rules or school rules or societal perceptions of how you should be behaving as a young woman.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to I think it's fair to say that there is a ton of work to do at the K through 12 level and the post-secondary level. There are different challenges in college, and it's interesting because Generation Hope, we support young parents who are working on their college degree. So we are often at that transition point between high school to college. We have worked with students who are, leaving their senior year of high school. They are, going to a school that requires uniforms, for example. Mm-hmm. And they get to a point in their pregnancy where they can't fit their uniform. We've had students who have been told, well, the policy is if you don't wear a uniform, you can't come to school. And so they're being forced to stay home from school. We've had to have conversations around Title IX protections, with those schools about what is allowable and what's not allowable, what is okay and what's not okay. And then what are the real ramifications in the life of that student? And I think Benita, talked about that. Disappearing from the school system has huge long-term impacts, not only on that student, but on their child, right? And then at the post-secondary level, we've had to help our students advocate with professors who they're being unbending with attendance policies for their class. When we have Generation Hope scholars, so we call them scholars, when one of our scholars is about to give birth, or is coming up against a parenting issue or challenge, has a sickness, something like that with their little one. So there's a ton of work. And I think what is interesting about higher ed is, this system, the higher ed system, is a very elitist system. There is a notion about who deserves to be sitting in a college classroom and who doesn't, and who is supposed to go to college and who is not supposed to go to college. And I think that there are some different perceptions and things that happen at the K through 12 level, but that is a real issue at the post-secondary level. And parenting students do not belong in a college classroom in terms of the way that higher ed currently functions. So it is extremely difficult to say, hey, this is a right that this student has, when the perception at a university or even at two-year colleges, sometimes we run up against this, that these students don't belong here, they should have made different life choices, and college isn't for them. So I think we have a lot of work to do at the post-secondary level as well.
A lot to say here. I was going to say thank you for surfacing that. This is a huge equity issue. It's a gender equity issue. It's a racial equity issue. And not just because women of color are more likely to be student moms, but also because of just the intersection of that bias. We are already told we don't belong in higher ed. And then when you find out you're a mom on top of it, or an active parent on top of it, it's just layer upon layer of bias and exclusion. But I do want to point out that most of what y'all have surfaced has been illegal for 50 years. Title IX, it requires pregnancy accommodations, so they should make that uniform change. It requires leave for medically necessary absences. So those students should be able to take the time that they need and come back. They should have lactation accommodations when they return, and non-discrimination. So all of these statements saying you don't belong here, I see those as Title IX huge red flags. But unfortunately, too many folks don't know about their rights, and too many administrators at the K-12 and college level are just now getting up to speed with these requirements that have been on the books for decades.
No, I agree. I think that people, was speaking to some friends, and they think about Title IX as it relates to access to sports. But I think about Title IX, obviously in the education context. But I think that what compounds the inability of people to assert, or young women, particularly poor young women, Black and brown poor young women, to assert their rights to education, is all of the other things, the interactions that they experience with systems, whether it is, I think about TANF. The TANF benefits does not support a pregnant and parenting student at the secondary or the post-secondary level. In fact, it's more punitive, it seems, at the post-secondary level. So it's just like, when you start to look at what's swirling around them, I feel like our role as advocates or as legal scholars is to make sure that we are pushing and, breaking through the noise on their behalf, because most times they're just trying to navigate what is already a Herculean task of accessing education, accessing their childcare that is not necessarily attached to a university, but is community-based. So there's limited access to seats or eligibility requirements that they may not meet. So I think that one of the things that in this new as we look at this 50-year-old law, or yes, 50-year-old law, what are the things that we also need to think about braiding our advocacy to support? Like TANF benefits are a huge issue for your ability to access and sustain your engagement in education or childcare. Those are two huge areas of concern.
Jessica, you said that we've had it's 50 years of Title IX. And as all of you have noted, students are still facing a variety of challenges. What was life like for students before Title IX? Like what's different now?
Well, okay.
Wow.
I am 51, and I'm telling you, like my parents, both of my parents, so it's interesting because that's when I happened upon that first case and really sat down with New York City. I was like, y'all know about Title IX and this is not cool. And they were like, oh my gosh, let's figure it out together. And they did. So that was the commitment that we had under that chancellor's leadership back when we made transformation. But I will say that I always think of myself as one of the Title IX babies, my brother and myself, because I was born in 1970. My parents were actively pushed out of school. But I also think that as a result of my mother being pregnant, but also as a result of what was happening around education and access for Black students in general around that time. Like I grew up in Michigan, they were in Michigan. There were a whole bunch of de facto segregation cases that were surfacing, and the Title IX or the lack of awareness is also an opportunity to control who has access to education. And I think you said that earlier, Nicole, right? I think you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's highly connected to bias and discrimination and all of these issues kind of converging together all at once. So absolutely.
Before Title IX, these opportunities, I don't even think were on the menu for most women, most people who could become pregnant. And, we've seen dramatic shifts. We now have more women PhDs graduating every year than men. We have gender parity or reverse parity. Women who traditionally have been in the mothering roles are now well represented in education, but which women are having that chance? That's really the thing that we want to lift up, is the fact that while we have seen tremendous changes, it still hasn't reached all of us yet. And we need to make sure that all of us have an equal chance at an education, and also that we're okay afterwards. You look at the student debt ratio for student parents, it is shocking. It is still a life-changing investment, but the costs are far too high.
Mm-hmm. You know what I was thinking when you said that about what was it like before? And it just dawned on me, the Crittenton schools and the Crittenton homes. But again, who had access to those things? Like I always think of like Mad Men, that television show, like what was it like before? But there were homes for pregnant girls, or there were adoptions, opportunities to get facilitate adoptions. But then then you talk about the valuation of babies, and who deserves to go back to their lives or to pick up where they left off, where a majority of those public or philanthropically supported opportunities were not available to Black women or brown women. They literally had to leave school and figure it out. So those are some of the other issues that this was I think that is not, Title IX is, the beginning, but like what shapes their lives is what really, we need to really think about that as we think about the next 50 years. Like what supports Title IX advocates should be talking about to braid together or blend together a shared agenda around change and access.
It actually keys into my next question, which is, what is the future of Title IX pregnancy protections? What work still needs to be done? Nicole, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it builds perfectly off of what we were just talking about. I mean, one thing that I think is really important to elevate is we released a study a couple of years ago where we were surveying student parents across the country and figuring out how they are experiencing higher education. One of the things we asked about was Title IX. It was really interesting that only about 40% of our students that we surveyed knew about Title IX and knew who they could talk to on their campus if there was a Title IX violation. So I think that's one big thing, is that so many students don't know their rights. They don't know about Title IX. They might connect it more to athletics and sports than they would to their own parenting situation. So I think we have a lot of work to do around educating folks, students, educating people working within our education institutions around what Title IX is, who it covers, who it supports, who it protects, and how do you do something about a violation, or maybe if you feel like your Title IX rights have been violated. So there's a lot of work to do there. I also think it's really important to think about the advances that Title IX has created for this population, but also to think about where things stand now with student parents. If you are a student parent, you're 10 times less likely to graduate than a non-parenting peer. You are, I think it's only about 8% of single mothers earn a degree within 6 years. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of building upon Title IX to make sure that there are protections in place, that people are aware of those protections, but also how do we transform our education spaces at the secondary level and at the post-secondary level to really embrace parenting. One of the things we've talked about today a lot is the challenges that parenting students are up against. But what we often leave out of the conversation are the assets that parenting students bring to any environment that they come into. I mean, these students are highly motivated. They are really driven. They are so resilient. They are excellent time managers. We know that student parents have 50% less time than their non-parenting peers to devote to their coursework, and yet they have higher GPAs on average than their non-parenting peers. So this is a population worth investing in, and it's not happening across our education systems. We have to do more to take the advances that have been made with Title IX, to build upon them, to bring in these other resources and supports like childcare, like TANF reform, all of those things, and just getting people to understand the connection between student parent work and DEI work, the extreme connection, the strong connection between making sure these students are successful and are thriving, and the race equity statements that so many institutions put out over the past 2 years with no action behind them. This is an opportunity to put real action behind those equity statements with a population that is here, that is ready, that is motivated, and that is deserving. And I think that to me is where we take the next 50 years.
What she said. Thank you. When we started the Pregnant Scholar back in, 2015, I present to Title IX coordinators and they would say, that sounds great. What law is that? We've come a really long way. People are on the whole trying to do right by these students, but you're absolutely right. There's so much more education to do. The Pregnant Scholars Helpline, we support people nationwide who are looking to implement policy changes or who need help navigating discrimination on their campus. And I can't tell you how many people say, like, where was this information when this crisis started? I wish I would have known sooner. So I hope everybody who's listening to this can help spread the word on that. To piggyback a bit off of what Nicole just said about what's next for Title IX, I'm really focused on what's happening after birth. Title IX regulations have those clear standards for accommodations, leave, and non-discrimination for the birthing parents. Afterwards, it's very light. We know that being a student parent, being a parent who's active, that's traditionally considered a feminized role, right? There's the motherhood bias and there's bias against men who are playing active parenting roles. There is a gender link, there is discrimination based on those old gender roles of what makes a good man, what makes a good woman, what makes a good parent or father, mother. But frankly, at the end of the day, that's really challenging to explain how policies which negatively impact student parents are also sex discrimination. That link has not been made by the Department of Education. That link's not been made on a lot of college campuses. And I think we really need to start talking about it. You know, if we want gender justice, we need to support all family caregivers, and we need to actually acknowledge the ways that student parents' caregiving duties are actually an issue that could be covered under Title IX, and that they could be institutions could be legally required to provide more support for their student parents as a part of pursuing gender equity in education. So that's where my head is. But I really have to say, I think it's all hands on deck for this population, especially with the pandemic. These are incredibly hard times for student parents, and we need a wider network of support to step up for them.
In terms of the future of Title IX, another question that I wanted to ask about it was that the Supreme Court seems poised to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is the landmark case establishing that people have a right to choose to have an abortion without significant government interference. Is there a way that might impact Title IX pregnancy protections for students?
I hope more folks step up to make sure that students who are forced to carry pregnancies are supported on the back end. Frankly, I'm sad we're even having this discussion. But I will, I'll say very clearly, if your choice is between, having an abortion, not continuing the pregnancy, or completely giving up on your educational goals, having no access to the career and economic opportunities you want, that's not a real choice either. We are doing this work in the name of gender equity, in the name of racial equity, and in the name of reproductive health justice. Because if that choice is completely limited, if we're not giving students the support they need to be healthy during their pregnancy and to actually continue on their education and support their families, that's not really a choice, frankly.
Yeah, I would just say, I think regardless of where people fall on this issue, there is something that no one can deny, which is there are not enough supports in place for young parents and for parenting college students to thrive. That is the fact. It is not something to debate. And so we have a lot of work to do if we want to see families thriving, all families thriving. This is where we have to put our energy and our investments. And at the end of the day, education is the best path to economic mobility for families. That's a, again, non-negotiable. It's a it is what it is. And so we have to put more investments in place to make sure that young people who do experience a pregnancy, who do become parents, as well as, college students who are parenting and are caregiving, that they have the resources that they need to get to that graduation stage. That's absolutely imperative. And something I just want to stress too, often I talk to folks about student parents, and this is a changing status. I could come into your university today and not be a parent. Tomorrow, I'm a parent, right? So this is an issue. This is not a small population that, is kind of separate and over here. This could be any college student at any time can become a parent. Same thing at the high school level. So we need to make sure that we have supports in place no matter what, so that all students can be successful. It's really important for people, I think, to make that connection and to not think of this group as this separate group, kind of away from these other students. Any student, I was an honor roll student. I was college bound. I had just been accepted into several different schools when I discovered my pregnancy. I was the last student that people would have thought would be a teen mom. And that's where I was. So I'm hoping that people also understand that this is important to invest in for all students and to have these supports in place.
I agree with you both. I do think when I think about Roe and what we're up against in the broader context and bringing it back to the reproductive justice discussion, like if people, if we're compelling people to have babies or if they're choosing to have babies. No matter the path to parenthood, we need to make sure that there are supports not only in place in the academic settings, but what are the supports that need to be around to fortify your participation in the academic setting? Because I think to your point earlier, you can enroll, but if you can't get through graduation, that's not going to put you on a path towards success, particularly for young people who are more economically vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Transportation, childcare, TANF, all of those things are, I mean, huge in terms of making sure that these folks are successful.
Yeah. And I think that there's an opportunity to not only as the education spreads among Title IX administrators about their obligations, also an opportunity to talk about coordinating a different understanding around policy as it pertains to those ancillary supports to keep young people in their education settings.
So I'm going to ask my last question. This is the same question I end all of my interviews on. Is there anything I didn't ask about that you think is really important for people to know?
Well, wow. I think that is more like not what do you need to know, but what do you need to do? Like how do we activate you to make change in your community? How do we activate you to pay attention to this particular issue? And if you are part of the conversations related to sports, how do you start to talk about the other pieces of Title IX? How do we activate you to be an activist around the issues embedded in Title IX that you may not be familiar with?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think all of this can be really overwhelming. We're talking about our entire economic system here and wrapped up in our education system and equity. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. There's a lot that individual campuses and communities can be doing to better support pregnant and parenting students. One small example, I have students contact me all the time who have to drop out of their STEM classes because they can't avoid toxic exposure. I had a student just tell me that her professor refused to tell her what chemicals she'd be exposed to in the lab, and is very worried about birth defects, right? So these are not, they don't have to always be massive investments. They don't have to always be nationwide programs. Just give us a shot at belonging at your institution, right? Focus on attacking as many of these angles as you can. And it's amazing what individual institutions have been able to accomplish with formal supportive policies for pregnant students and for parenting students.
Yeah, I think totally echo all of that. I think I would add, I had a conversation around Title IX a couple of years ago with some folks working in higher ed. And one of the things that was like a common theme was institutions feeling like they didn't have the resources to fully implement and educate folks within the institution around Title IX. And I also think about the fact that the largest share of student parents are at community colleges. So we're talking about historically underfunded institutions. I think there's an opportunity here to also talk about what do institutions need in terms of resources and supports to be able to really implement these changes, to be able to enforce policies, create policies, to educate their workforce around Title IX rights, to make sure they're educating students and informing students, whether it's sending a text over a mass text system and saying, hey, do you know you have Title IX rights? It's interesting because there's tension between these students, are most likely to be at historically underfunded institutions that are going to be cash strapped when it comes to having the resources to actually put a lot of these things in place and in motion. So I think there's also a conversation around how do we provide the resources for these institutions to provide the support to their students and to their community.
And the Department of Education is about to put out new Title IX regulations. A lot of folks are going to be focused on Title IX and what we need to do to make the dream a reality. So this is the moment. This is the time. If you're feeling motivated, please join us.
Thank you so much. This was a fabulous conversation. I'm so honored to experience so much of your expertise. And I hope that our audience found it equally edifying. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. A heads up that the next conversation involves sexual assault and could be difficult for some viewers to watch. If you want to take a break and come back to us, the session after begins in 30 minutes. How has Title IX evolved over the years to confront and root out sexual harassment and gender-based violence on campus? To answer that question, we have with us today Karla Arango, a student survivor and advocate at End Rape on campus. She's a rising senior at Northern Kentucky University. Anne Oliverius, one of the plaintiffs in the historic Alexander v. Yale University case. She's now a prominent lawyer and chair of the executive committee at McAllister Oliverius Law. And Shawali Patel, Director of Justice for Student Survivors at the National Women's Law Center. She leads advocacy addressing sexual harassment in schools and works to strengthen civil rights protections for queer students. Candace Norwood, reporter at the 19th, will moderate this conversation. Candace?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to our guests today for joining me to discuss Title IX, which bans sexual discrimination in education, and specifically Title IX as it relates to gender-based violence on campuses. I feel like it makes sense to start with you, Anne. You were a plaintiff in a 1980 case, Alexander v. Yale. That was the first case to use Title IX to challenge sexual harassment at a university. So, Anne, can you summarize for us the issues at the center of that case, the outcome of that case, and how it shaped how schools have been handling sexual harassment since?
Sure. We actually filed that case in 1978. When I went up at Yale, it had just started taking women really in a big way. Before then, of course, it was a very different world, a lot more sex segregation than what we have now. I went to Yale, and in 10 years after my 10th year there, not me, but the Yale had been coeducated for 10 years. The Yale Corporation, which is its governing body, asked me to prepare a report on the status of women at Yale. How are we doing 10 years in? That was 1977 when I had that request. And so I interviewed a whole bunch of students, and we did a lot of humorous things that we recounted, pictures of white boys up on the walls endlessly, big chairs for big white men. That was the aura. But what came through was that there are a lot of women who were having sexual affairs with their professors, and who felt that if they didn't sleep with their professors, they wouldn't get the grades they felt they had earned and deserved. They wouldn't get the recommendations that they needed to go on to the next step in life. And so we tried to do something about this. We told the Yale Corporation, and Yale's president, Kingman Brewster at the time, was quite a distinguished feature and figure in American society. And they ultimately said, yeah, okay, that might be the case, but we don't really care about that. And we're going to support the men, the faculty members who are having these affairs with the girls, and we just want the problem to disappear. So we filed suit, and I helped to develop with Catherine McKinnon, who is a feminist legal theorist, and Simon and Harvey, two Yale lawyers, a theory that said that Title IX says and protects us under law that if women are not given the same access to an education as a man is, then that's a violation of the civil rights laws. And if you have to sleep with somebody, if you have to have a sexual relationship with someone to be able to get educated and to get what's due to you under education, then that's a discrimination. That was a novel theory. Yale decided to just hope that we would all graduate so the problem would go away. And in fact, most of us did graduate, and they said that the case was moot. They didn't have to resolve it, except for one Black woman who was still on that case. She lost. But the fact is that the judge said, what you're arguing is actually, you're right, a civil rights violation. First time that it was ever argued in law for education. But that judge said, all right, we back you. After that, as of course you all know the story, case after case after case was filed, and those cases kept winning and winning based on our legal theory that if you're denied an education because of sexual issues, events, because you have to provide sex, that you're not getting educated under the law in the United States, and something has to be done. So that's how Title IX was enforced, starting at that point. It had never been enforced that way before. What it had been used for before was, of course, sports. That was the big issue we had been fighting for. But, and my generation was the generation who carried picket signs as our sport then. And that's what we had. We had those issues with sport, but now we also had sex.
And to follow up with you, Anne, there may be people watching who don't necessarily understand how or why sexual harassment and gender-based violence is considered a discrimination issue. Can you dig into that a bit more and explain to us why that is the case?
Sure. Men and women get raped and sexually assaulted. There's no question about that. But certainly it's a fair thing to say that sex-based offenses, rape, sexual assault, is mostly a gendered crime. It mostly happens towards women. So that was the thinking when I was at Yale, for instance, I was strangled and raped by a man who's now a doctor at UC Davis in California, Dr. Calvin Hirsch, who's a geriatrician. And when I reported it to the Yale police, their response was, well, he's a white guy and he's going to be a doctor. And he's like good, solidly middle class or aspiring upper class. Those guys don't rape. It must have been my fault. That was the Yale police's report. They wouldn't even take me to Yale New Haven Hospital. There was no rape kit. There was nothing. I could do nothing. And I made a lot of noise about this. I was soon after with Gloria Steinem at Wesleyan, and there was a convocation there of maybe 1,000 students, mostly women, but some men. And at that convocation, I asked, how many of you have been raped? There wasn't one person in that auditorium who raised his or her hand to say, yep, I have been. And I hesitated and I said, all right, have any of you been date raped? Which was the first time I think that term was ever used. It's been captured in literature by Susan Faludi since, but at that day, and there was a quiet, and then all of a sudden around the room, almost every hand went up, signaling, yeah, this is experience, this is an epidemic that is happening still today, and it was happening then, but there was no name to it. Nobody had identified and said, this is a problem and we need to solve this problem. This is unacceptable. So that's where that started, that notion that gender-based violence is something we need to do something about. The first thing we have to do is name it.
And I want to turn to you, Shawali. I mean, I understand that there are a lot of schools throughout the country that may have a range of responses to violence and harassment. But I do want to ask you, how have we seen schools' policies and the handling of these types of allegations evolve in the decades since Alexander v. Yale?
Yeah, school policies have definitely gone through a lot of changes just based on requirements set by the federal government when it comes to Title IX protections for sexual harassment. So Title IX is a broad civil rights statute, and it prohibits a broad range of sex-based discrimination, including sexual harassment. And the Department of Education is one of the main federal agencies that is tasked with enforcing Title IX. So that means that if a student experiences sex discrimination, including sexual harassment, their school does a terrible job in responding, they can turn to the Department of Education for relief. They can file a complaint, an administrative complaint with the Department of Education, which is separate than filing a complaint with a court, a private lawsuit, kind of like, the Alexander v. Yale case that Anne was a plaintiff in. And so in their administrative enforcement, the Department of Education relies on standards that are often articulated through guidance or regulation or rules. And so the Department of Education first issued guidance in 1997 that articulated what the requirements are for schools when responding to sexual harassment. And they reissued that guidance in 2001. It was pretty broad. It required schools to respond to sexual harassment, looking at it, whether or not it was severe or pervasive. It required employees to respond if they had noticed or if they should have known about the harassment. It was broader than what the courts have later required in a pair of cases that came out of the Supreme Court in 1998 and 1999. I'll call Davis and Gebser. The Davis case was 99, Getzer's 98. And unfortunately, in those cases, the Supreme Court set really stringent standards for student survivors that are actually more burdensome for a student who experiences sexual harassment than an adult employee who is suing their workplace. So in light of that, the Department of Ed visited their guidance in 2001, and they maintained their standards. And then in 2011, under the Obama administration, the Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter explaining what schools are supposed to do, reiterating a lot of the protections that were in the 2001 and 1997 guidance documents. And they also made clear that schools have to use the preponderance of the evidence standard. There's got a lot of attention. That is the most equitable standard. It means more likely than not. And it's a standard that the department has also acknowledged would be required for racial harassment cases, for example, in separate enforcement actions. And it's a standard that is used in civil rights litigation. But around that time, there was growing student activism. Groups like Know Your Nine and Rape on Campus, Serve Justice, which were founded by student survivors around 2012, 2013, came to light because students were really frustrated that sexual violence, while so pervasive, their schools were not responding. Anne mentioned that this is very pervasive for decades. It's been quite consistent that so many students experience it, and yet schools were still getting it wrong when it came to responding. And through student activism and demands by these students to the Department of Education, basically urging them to enforce Title IX, to protect them and to actually take enforcement action against schools who violate their rights, the Department of Education issued additional guidance in 2014 that provide more clarification. And this was important guidance that, it explained what does it mean when a school is on notice? What does it mean if an employee knows about sexual harassment, which includes sexual assault? What are the steps they're supposed to take in response to it? What does a grievance process, like an investigation or hearing, what does an equitable grievance process look like where both parties are treated fairly? It provided helpful information that led to a lot of students being informed of what their rights were under Title IX. And as a result, there was an increase in complaints that were filed with the Department of Education, just because more students knew they had rights and they trusted the federal government to enforce their rights. However, with this progress that was happening, with more and more enforcement of Title IX, more awareness of protections, increase in schools responding to it, although there were still a lot of issues, there came a backlash. Much of this backlash arose while the hashtag #MeToo movement became viral, and it was also facing a backlash. Because with more enforcement of Title IX, there were some groups, including men's rights advocates, who were concerned about, they claimed that the pendulum has swung too far, which actually wasn't true because survivors were still having their rights violated. But unfortunately, this was a narrative that the Trump administration really followed. And so when Trump came into the presidency in 2019, Betsy DeVos, as Secretary of Education, started the process for undoing this guidance from 2011 and 2014. That much of it resulted from student survivor activism and actually led to more enforcement. They rescinded that guidance and started the process to change the Title IX regulations. Again, these are the rules that dictate how the Department of Education understands Title IX's protections and enforces them. And ultimately, they changed the final rule, the Title IX rule or regulation, in 2020. It went into effect in August. And they significantly weakened protections against sexual harassment. the Department of Education has set a very narrow definition of sexual harassment so that it has to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive rather than severe or pervasive. It would require for college campuses, would allow for college campuses, schools to ignore more reports of sexual harassment just because they're not reported to the right individual. So it only requires, a narrow set of employees to actually do something with the report. And it actually requires schools to dismiss complaints under their Title IX policies if the complaints are not of harassment that meets this, severe, pervasive, objectively offensive threshold. If it occurs outside of an education program or activity, even if the survivor has to face a class with their rapist and be triggered and traumatized by that. So really set limitations on what schools can respond to. And then for students who are able to overcome these hurdles and have their complaint responded to through a grievance process, an investigation or hearing, for college campuses in particular, really set a burdensome process that is stacked against survivors. It removed protections that existed for decades. It put in requirements like direct live cross-examination by a party's advisor of choice, who could be anyone. It could be a parent of a student who assaulted someone. It can be their fraternity brother. It can allow one student to afford an expensive attorney, whereas the other student couldn't, and they would have a teacher, let's say, or a professor who's representing them. You can imagine the inequities then that would follow. And so luckily, though, when the Biden administration came in, early into the administration, they indicated that they're going to review these rules that DeVos Trump administration put into place and start the rulemaking process to undo them. But unfortunately, until there is a final rule, we are stuck with the DeVos rule. We're still waiting on a proposed rule from the Biden administration, which hopefully will come out soon to begin the process.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Karla, Shawali has gone over quite a bit already, but I'm wondering from your perspective in the work that you do, when a student has experienced harassment, assault, or other gender-based violence, what do you see as some of the biggest hurdles that remain, to this day in terms of the current systems in place and the responses they receive?
Absolutely. I feel like the first and most important thing to remember is that a lot of the foundational components of Title IX were based on a very particular group of individuals. It was most likely kind of trying to make sure that specifically white cis women were protected. And then obviously now that we see that women of color, trans and non-binary individuals, we have queer students that are most making up that majority of the population that is being affected by sexual violence on campuses. They feel like they cannot go to the coordinator in the Title IX or to authorities or anyone and really feel like they're going to be taken seriously. Especially, I know I can speak on behalf of being a Hispanic woman, is that when it comes to certain communities, not everyone within that community is going to react to sexual violence in the same way. For example, I know that within my generation, it's being talked about a little bit more, but even flashback to my mother's generation, you do not talk about any form of sexual violence that has occurred to you or someone that you know. So I think going back to Title IX, there is a very big cultural disconnect when it comes to the process itself and the grievance process. Like Shawali mentioned, most students, if they're in college, they cannot afford expensive attorneys if they're having to do it by themselves. So when you're looking at that cross-examination part, you also have international students that don't necessarily understand our legal system. They don't know the resources that are given to them. We don't really have translated materials within our Title IX office that are directly available to these students, to the point where they can be worried that one, they may get into legal trouble or that their status will be used against them or anything like that. So you have marginalized students that are experiencing a majority of these forms of sexual violence that feel like they cannot report simply because they will not be properly represented or respected within those spaces. And it's also important to mention that within this space, I know that as like a student that works within the advocacy center on campus, we have been seeing a lot of gender nonconforming students coming in, and they ask the question of like, how do these terms and how does this definition of like sex discrimination fit into me and like my identity? And obviously, like, I cannot really speak on like the extent of that, but when I get asked those questions, it's hard to even point them in the right direction of guidance, because you look at like faculty and staff on campus that don't really identify within those populations either, and it's like, who can I point them to get those like connections and to get that, even if like their family's not supportive, or even if they are, it's a lot different when those surrounding you and that are wanting to help you don't necessarily understand the fullest capacity of your identity. And I think that's something that definitely should be improved on when it comes to the wording within the new Title IX policy that hopefully the Biden administration will implement soon, is just making sure that the language is both trauma informed and that it's making sure to center those marginalized groups and ensure that they are also being represented within that language.
Thank you. And, you know, to follow up with you, Karla, in your mind, in through conversations that you've may have had with other survivors and activists, is there a sense of what the ideal reporting and grievance process looks like at a college or university, or is it kind of specific to that community, or what are your thoughts on that?
I really think that it's hard to do one umbrella like grievance process that is going to fit everyone. Because even I know for me personally, I underwent a Title IX like kind of grievance process and investigation process prior to the DeVos like rules being implemented. And even then, like, I'm a first generation student. And while like I can understand English, like I can understand like kind of the legality of everything, it still felt like I was like not being represented properly, simply because some students with like the faculty and staff on campus, or even student employees that are mandatory reporters, they can go to this individual that they've gained trust with, like a professor, and then their professor automatically may have to report something because that's just part of their job description. So I think when looking at a new Title IX policy, I think it's really important to just make it like survivor centered and give that autonomy back to those students and those individuals on campus, and really kind of create some sort of format and foundation to where the survivor themselves are able to make every single step along the process that best fits them. And I think that for future policies, it's really important, I think no matter what the policy looks like, to really get away with that cross-examination, especially since it's so broad that it could be quite literally anyone, like Shawali mentioned. Like, it could be the best friend of the person that was accused. It could be like any person close to an abuser, or even a professional attorney going against a student that does not have those resources or doesn't even really understand why they're being cross-examined in the first place. And I also would really, really like to see like academic protection within the Title IX like programming and within the Title IX policies in the future, because I feel like a lot of survivors face a lot of issues when it comes to their whole process, whether they report it or not, in terms of wanting that academic protection, especially because many students have scholarships that have certain GPAs that they have to maintain. And if for some reason you have a class with your abuser, you have to see your abuser every day, or you're just genuinely like not able to get out of bed and your grades start to decline, then how does that play a role into what you're protected in under Title IX? Like, how is Title IX going to maintain the autonomy of the student when it comes to their academics, and make sure that students are protected if they do need to take a semester off because of the trauma that they've endured, or anything in between? I think that some sort of academic policy needs to also be incorporated into Title IX.
Thank you, Karla. And Anne, back to you. Shawali has already given us a great overview of different changes that have been made at the federal level, the Department of Education, et cetera, with regards to Title IX and gender-based violence. And I'm wondering, Anne, if you have thoughts on, like, what do you see as the significance of the federal government, specifically the White House, the Department of Education, and do you have recommendations for what you would like to see as far as action moving forward to address these issues?
Well, of course, I'm a lawyer who operates in the Title IX area every day. We take cases around the world, but we are experts in Title IX litigation in the United States. So we get students after they've been beaten up, after they've been defeated, when they have no other alternative. And we offer some safety to them because the schools are not doing that. Now, everything Karla has just said, I applaud. Exactly, I'm on the same page as you as what has to get done. But I think we're only going to achieve change, positive change, and we're going to stop this problem when we actually go and put in regulations, and Biden, I hope, will do this administration. And I'm sorry, I want to say, I voted, I had a lot of hope for this administration. It has taken them a long time to get out of the box here. Everything Karla has said, she could have said and probably did before Biden came into office. This is not new stuff. This is stuff we've been talking about. Everybody knows who works in this sector what has to get done. So the fact that Biden's administration has not moved yet really fills me with dread and sadness. And I'm not as optimistic as I once was that we're going to get good results. But I think what has to happen is actually somewhat radical, but simple. We've got to get on those campuses and we've got to make sure that if there's been deliberate indifference, which is the legal standard, if the university takes more than just a couple of weeks to do an investigation, often they take a year and a half. If they take more than a few weeks and the outcome supports the person, the victim, then I think that the university and the administrator in charge has got to be charged, penalized with a money fine. Once the money moves, once the money gets set up against a university, they will find their interests are to defend the people who are hurt. And right now, universities' interests are their own. It's their reputation. They're into heavy denial, not a big problem. She asked for it after all. You get versions of all this stuff all the time. We have to stop it. We have to align our interests. The university's interest has got to be put squarely behind the survivors, period. And you do that by charging a money penalty against universities. Years ago, after Alexander for Yale, I had a whole bunch of kids, and 2 daughters were at Yale some years ago, and they brought a case to the office, to Office of Civil Rights, to OCR, and it said this is this case against a frat, where our frat boys, where Brett Kavanaugh is a member of this frat, by the way, but nonetheless, they came down to the Women's Center and they said, yes means no means yes, and yes means anal. And they chanted this outside the Women's Center. No means yes, yes means anal, over and over again. And the women inside got really terrified. And they came together and they filed a complaint, which we helped organize against OCR. OCR, interestingly, charged Yale $100,000 plus for this violation. Why do they keep the frats on campus? Harvard doesn't have frats. Princeton has really effectively handled this problem. Why does Yale, for instance, have to have frats? So given that, they had to pay a money fine. And it was fascinating for me, as someone who went to Yale and who sued Yale a number of times, that Yale was so insulted that they had to pay money. That these people that allegedly are so much better than everybody else, that they actually had to be held accountable. And they paid a lot of money for lawyers to defend them. They got the charge dropped down to maybe 80,000 or something. I forget the exact amounts, but it was interesting to see how they rallied and really fought hard. We need to capture that energy and that arrogance and put it so they actually defend the students. We've got to reorientate their thinking. It really is. Years ago, we started suing the Catholic Church for pedophile priests, decades ago. Now we sue almost every religion, because every religion that is organized by men and where men are in power has abuse. This is what we've learned. So we have a wide practice in this area. But we started then suing universities, again, going back a decade ago. And every time we won against the churches, maybe a bishop would come to me and say, Dr. Olivares, we're good people. We don't need to have this happen. Sure, Father Joe may have, misconducted himself. I would say, Your Highness, Your Excellency, misconducted himself, 110 boys that we know about, 29 parishes. At what point do you open your eyes and apologize? And they felt they didn't really have to do that. We've now gotten them to do that. The Catholic bishops now apologize, not as loudly as we'd like, but they do that. But when we sue Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, I have never encountered such arrogance intellectually. When they lose, they say, well, really, it's not our fault. They do not take responsibility. They are not accepting that they have to be accountable. We need to make them accountable. And I think money, which is the currency of justice in America, money will start to make them accountable. Let them pay some real money. And the person who's in charge, the Title IX officers, the presidents, whoever are in charge, they need to get on top of this. And we will not have our students beaten up, raped, assaulted, which happens to 1 out of 3 of our university students. It is shocking. And we need to stop it and care about that and say, enough, enough. And yes, call on me as a lawyer. That's what I do for a living. But the laws have to change. We need to make it possible that we can get justice sooner, faster, better, and keep our students protected. American students are not protected right now.
Thank you for that. We just have a few minutes, unfortunately, left. So I kind of want to do go around and have you all answer a question that can hopefully be optimistic. I mean, I just want to know what you all are seeing or hearing or reading that gives you hope that we can make strides towards supporting survivors in regards to this issue. We can start with Shwali.
What gives me hope these days is just seeing the incredible student activism that's happening all over the country. And, it's not just happening on college campuses, but we're seeing it in middle schools and high schools. There have been protests like every other day. I feel like I'm reading about one where students who are rightfully angered by their schools failing to respond appropriately to sexual harassment, for punishing survivors who've come forward with reports, which happens way more often than people realize, that these students are fed up and they know that they have rights. They know that that Title IX exists, that they're entitled to protections under the law, and they're demanding that their school does something about it. And for me, that gives me a lot of hope. I know student activism, in the past has led to a lot of changes. It led to the Alexander v. Yale case. It led to OCR changes. Like, students have been extremely instrumental in pushing for strong Title IX protections, pushing their institutions to do more to protect their rights. So, despite the frustrations that I too have with the administration not even having yet proposed changes to the Title IX rule, it's been so long. I remain hopeful because of the students and the incredible organizing and advocacy that they've been doing.
So Wally really stole my answer there, but I'm a little bit biased as a student. But I, like Shwali said, seeing like younger students like in like middle schools and high schools, and knowing that when I was in their position that I was experiencing similar things, but like I didn't feel like I had the voice and like that power to like stand up, and seeing that because of amazing women that have come in our past, like Anne, that have kind of paved that way and paved that path for like women to be able to stand up and for other students to be able to stand up. And I also think that having more and more organizations that are being founded to improve like Title IX and to eventually stop sexual violence as a whole, like End Rape on Campus, like It's on Us, like those organizations are really foundationally trying to help students as much as possible. And you're also seeing even more and more individuals of color like coming forward and being those like CEOs, being those executive directors. And I think that that is opening up this whole other world for marginalized communities to be like, if I have an advocate for me that looks like me, then I can come forward and I can speak on this and I can get my power back. So I think that that representation is super powerful and has been making a really big change.
And the last minute, Anne, final thoughts.
Let me first, Karla and Shwali, thank you. Thank you so much for what you're doing. It makes a positive difference. I want to assure you that I'm in the courtroom all the time with this and at universities fighting in your corners, and thank you for what you're doing. Candace, thank you for moderating this. I think the hope for the future is that this generation of people who are sexually assaulted, they name, when they're sexually harassed, they need to name the person who does it. Universities want confidentiality. I think that's a dreadful thing. It has to be stopped. Confidentiality protects the men who rape and abuse. That's all it does. We need to find our voices, and we need to publish the names of the people who do these bad, terrible things that ruin lives. And we need to stand tall on that and make sure the defamation laws protect us. And in fact, our firm is putting up something called The True, which is a website that's going to tell rape stories only if you name your rapist. And we're going to have jokes and comedies, and it's going to be an entertainment sort of magazine about it. And I hope to change the conversation about rape. But this generation, at least, will own that experience. Karla, you said your parents, in that generation, they didn't. But now we need to say, yep, it happened to me. And in my case, it was Dr. Calvin Hirsch, and it's not acceptable. And I'm going to name that person. And I think that's how you stop it. So that's what I'd like to see, is name your offender, name the person who's done this terrible thing. No more confidentiality.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts on this important issue. And we'll see how things shape up moving forward.
Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. Now I know you'll enjoy this performance by singer, songwriter, and activist Milk. She's performing her single, Power.
Take the power back, baby. Fall so in love with your inner lady. No sense chasing what you could have been. Let these battles make a champion. Say hello like it's the first time that you met. You're so beautiful, I won't leave you again. Ooh, I'm finally seeing who I am. I feel the power coming back. I hold my heart in my own hands. I feel the power coming back. Power, ooh, power, ooh, hey. No matter your features, we're all the same, tender loving creatures, taking steps upon the earth. Don't need anyone to tell you what you're worth. Say hello like it's the first time that you met. You're so beautiful, I won't leave you again. Ooh, I'm finally seeing who I am. I feel the power coming back. I hold my heart in my own hands. I feel the power coming back. Power, ooh, power, ooh, power, ooh, power, ooh.
Thank you, Milk. That was beautiful. Over the last couple of decades, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, a Republican from South Carolina, has forged her own path. She was the first woman to graduate from the Citadel, a prominent military college, and is the first woman from South Carolina to be elected to Congress. This interview does briefly mention sexual assault. Leading the conversation is Mariel Padilla, reporter at the 19th. Mariel?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks so much for having this conversation with us, Representative. As we mark 50 years of Title IX, it feels especially important to discuss how far gender equality has come, especially given you've been a trailblazer both in higher education and in your state. Now, I want to start by asking you about your experience at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I have to say that I am personally very excited to be talking to the first woman to have graduated from this military college because my own mother actually was a math professor there a few years before your time. So she was able to teach Shannon Faulkner, who, as I'm sure you know, was the first woman to enroll, though she did not end up graduating. So I would love to hear about your time there. What brought you there? What was it like being one of the first women in that space?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I graduated there, I guess, 23 years ago in the summer of 1999. It's kind of amazing when I look back. And I just went to a graduation for one of my family members a few weeks ago. I hadn't been back to graduation in a really long time, but my father is a graduate of the Citadel. And so it was all male, for 154 years before women were able to apply and be accepted and enroll and graduate from there. But I'm a product of a military family. Most of my family has served in the military, but most of the graduates of the Citadel don't eventually go in the military. We have about a third that do that. But I stumbled on some really hard times in my life when I was young and I was growing up. I was raped when I was 16, and I dropped out of high school on my 17th birthday. And my parents had said to me, if you're going to stop going to school, you got to start going to work. And I learned some really tough lessons during some extraordinarily tough times in my life. And during that time, I learned about the value of hard work. And I was a waitress at a Waffle House, believe it or not. And I used to stand on a piece of duct tape about a foot wide, and I would yell at the cooks in the back how my customers wanted their hash browns. And I would, order and serve food to my customers at all times of day. And so, I'm really proud of where I got my start, and it shows how far you can go. Even as I dropped out of school, learning the value of second chances, learning the value of hard work, and figuring out, how to get my life back in order, how to get it back together after going through so much pain and trauma, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And it was during that time, the principal of my high school was a graduate of the Citadel. So there's this recurring theme of Citadel grads in my life. And he allowed me to take college courses when I was in high school at a local community college. So when I was at night or on the weekends taking courses at a local college, community college, and I was able to get my high school diploma in about 6 months. And I technically graduated high school a year early at the age of 17. And this was in 1995. And then 1996, a year later, there was a Supreme Court case against the Virginia Military Institute, or VMI, that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion on, and said if your college or university received any government funding, you couldn't discriminate based on gender. And that was a huge decision, which seems perfectly normal, but actually back then in the mid-90s, it was very controversial. And that was in 1996 when she rendered that decision. And 2 days later, the Citadel decided to let women in. They weren't going to fight, not keeping them out for any longer. And I applied within 24 hours. As soon as they made that decision, I went down to the campus and picked up my application and turned it in. And I went to the Citadel, and it wasn't for me to break a glass ceiling. It wasn't to be the first woman. In fact, I don't really consider myself much of a feminist, right? I'm just someone that wants to do what everybody else can do. I want to be able to do whatever any man can do, right? We should have that right to be able to do that. And if we work hard, we set goals, we have ambition, we can achieve, we can be successful. And so when that happened, it really changed my life. And I went there not to be the first, but I went there because I had something to prove to myself as a woman who was raped at the age of 16. I had something to prove to my family and to my parents. I could go to a place that I could be challenged, that I could face adversity, and that I could face an obstacle like anything I'd faced in my life, and I wouldn't quit. Like I quit school, and I would be successful, and I would achieve something. And I learned a lot of valuable lessons going through a very difficult experience like that, but I loved every minute of it too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned challenges. Can you elaborate on what kinds of challenges you faced at the Citadel?
Well, certainly when you're breaking a glass ceiling, I mean, there's all sorts of things. I had people threatening to shoot me, and people threatening to shoot my family. I learned about sexual harassment and what that was, and the kind of words that people will sometimes use when they are harassing you. And there was a bomb threat even at my graduation. And to think that is the experience that I went through as an 18-year-old is really remarkable. And today as a member of Congress, I still get those same threats because it's a very divisive time politically. And I sometimes joke, it was a serious time that I was trained for this. I was built for this. I was built for tough. But I learned about having courage facing those challenging moments. And I learned about what it took to have a voice and using that voice, no matter what the repercussions were, no matter the consequences, having a voice and using it and giving a voice to those who don't have one, giving a voice to the voiceless. And I also learned not only about courage, but then I learned through those challenges about confidence, because if we don't believe in ourselves, then no one's going to believe in us. And that's true when you're a woman in the boardroom or in business or a CEO or at work day to day. That's true when you're starting a company. It's true when you're running for office. It's true when you're trying to legislate and create laws and get laws signed into get a bill signed into law. It's true when I'm putting my kids to bed at night, hopefully at 9 o'clock tonight on a school night. But also in that all male environment, when there are just a handful of women there, I learned about what women do to other women. And most of the time, we don't support one another. And I had an experience when I was in my second year. I was a sophomore cadet at the Citadel. And I remember I was a lot tougher on the other women that were coming behind me than I was on the men. And I recognized this in myself. And then when I got my first job at a consulting firm, my first boss was a woman. And I remember my female colleagues and I saying, man, isn't she treating us differently or tougher on us than she is on our male colleagues who are doing the same job with the same pay, everything else. And that was a really valuable experience. You see it all the time. You see it in politics, you see it in business, you see it at the workplace, you see it in your communities and in your neighborhoods, that we just do this a lot of times. And that doesn't help us achieve our dreams. That doesn't help us achieve our goals. That does not help us become more successful. And in some cases, it makes it tougher for other women who want to continue to break barriers, who want to continue to break glass ceilings. It makes it tougher on those women too, in trying to set a good example for the women that are going to come behind them. So those are really valuable lessons to learn in that environment.
Right, right. Absolutely. And you mentioned that you have been back, recently went to a graduation. From your perspective, when it comes to discrimination in federally funded educational programs, what progress has been made from what you can see, and what more could or should be done?
You have leadership within our college campuses that are to ensure that everyone is treated fairly, that they're treated equally, and that there are reporting mechanisms for when there are incidents. But there are still issues on college campuses. For example, in one of the colleges in my backyard, in my congressional district, there was a few students a few years ago that were trying to create a nonpartisan political organization, and the campus barred them from creating it. And they had to sue to create a nonpartisan political group on campus, because there's this thing called free speech. And by the Constitution, as a student, you should be able to exercise that speech anywhere. And so you do see from time to time issues on campus. But in our case, we had leadership within the school where incidents could be reported or investigated. And there was that reporting mechanism. And then you could report individuals within the Citadel. In the cadet leadership, you could report someone if there were inappropriate behavior or inappropriate treatment or something that was unfair and not equal. It's really important to learn the value of being able to speak up and to speak for yourself, and to have that kind of courage, which is not easy, particularly when you're young or you're in school, you're in college. But it's really important for folks to step up regardless of the consequences, to make those experiences known, to make those experiences heard, to share those experiences so that we may then learn from them and better improve systems that are in place for those that may be experiencing some of those challenges.
Mm-hmm. And can you speak to how culture of a school, culture of a campus plays into some of these challenges, and whether you've seen changes when it comes to culture?
Yeah, I mean, certainly every campus is different. You've got public schools, you've got private schools, you have schools that, focus on engineering, or you have schools that focus on the liberal arts, or, medical schools, et cetera. So really every environment is different. I do believe that our colleges today are doing their best job when they can to ensure an equal and level playing field for everybody, regardless of their zip code, the color of skin, their gender, where they're coming from, the amount of money they make or their families make coming into that. And you've seen that progress over the years. And in some cases, when you have a school that isn't, there ought to be repercussions for it, even financially. Like I'm a big supporter of, hey, if that school isn't doing the right thing or behaving in the right manner, then you withhold some of their government funding. There are ways to institute incentives to ensure that schools do the right things. As I said earlier, these students had a First Amendment right, and that was just maybe 4 or 5 years ago that happened. It's pretty recent. That's why it's really important for students to speak up and to have a voice and to organize. In fact, we had a hearing on the oversight committee, and we had some students come in and testify, and it was about curriculum in schools, and they were all witnesses for the other side of the aisle, which was fine. But to listen to these students and the way that they organize on their campuses was pretty amazing. So students today have far better tools to organize, and that's through social media, that's through apps, to organize and have their voices heard, to get meetings with the president of colleges, to get that information out there, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on or what issue you're working on. You have a voice and you have the tools and the resources, most of the time free, to utilize that voice. And I would encourage students to continue doing that. There's some really remarkable examples of students on both sides of the aisle having their voices heard because of the advance in technology, the apps that we have to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about your political career. You are the first Republican woman to be elected to Congress from South Carolina. And so I just want to hear a little bit about what brought you to politics, what made you decide to pursue that.
Well, when I was 18, I started voting in general elections and presidential elections. I've been voting since I was young, since I had the right to vote. And I would encourage everyone who's 18 or older, if you're not registered, get registered and vote and have your voice heard. But I really wasn't involved in politics until I was an adult and I was in my 30s. I didn't really know a whole lot about it. I knew you voted in presidential elections, but I didn't know really much more beyond that. But in 2008, I was a young mom. I had a 2-year-old and I was pregnant with my second child, and I wanted to stay at home, but I also wanted to work. And so I had this challenge before me. And so I started my own business, and I was able to work from home in my business. And one of my first clients, it was in 2010. I started my company in 2008. And in 2010, I got my first political client. I was doing technology and PR and marketing for business to business sort of clients. But I met now Senator Tim Scott. I met Mick Mulvaney, who was a congressman from South Carolina. I met Tom Rice, who I serve with in the House now in Congress as well. But I took on my first political clients, and I was doing some technology for them, like building websites and doing some communications work for their campaigns. And I was just so inspired by their leadership and what they were doing and the work that they did. It was really impressive. And in particular, the way that they operated, they're all three really extraordinary leaders. And Tim Scott's story is remarkable if you've not heard it. And the only Black Republican in the United States Senate. And we come from the same cloth. We both had challenges growing up, and now we're both elected officials within the state of South Carolina. In fact, I represent his congressional district, the first congressional district. But I took on a couple of political clients, and I loved every minute of it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I ran for the US Senate in my mid-30s in 2014, not a few years after that. I lost. It was terrible. And I said, oh, I'm never going to do this again. But then in 2017, there was a special election. My own state House rep had to resign. And in a special election in South Carolina was about 10 weeks. And I was like, well, I can do anything for 10 weeks. And I ran and I won. And I won, and I became really effective at it, and I loved it. It gave me purpose in life. It drives who I am. And I've had a lot of successes. And in fact, in my first 3 years in office as a state lawmaker, I had a bill signed into law, which is very rare for anyone, let alone someone who's pretty new at the job. And that was a prison reform bill. I do a lot of work on civil rights. And it was a civil rights type of legislation that a Republican governor signed into law. And it was a conservative bill. And so now today in Congress, I ran for the seat and I flipped it from Democrat to Republican in November of 2020. I'm the highest ranking Republican on a committee, on the Oversight Committee, and it's the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Committee. And so I'm pursuing a body of work that I started as a state lawmaker, and that's really important to my district and really important to me personally. And it's sort of ironic now looking back at my life as someone who's broken glass barriers, broken glass ceilings, as the first woman to graduate from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, and as the first Republican woman from the state of South Carolina to ever be elected to Congress. That work on civil rights is really important, and that we continue that work, and that we have Republicans at the table leading on that civil rights work.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's an incredible story. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to get to this last question. How have your experiences and challenges you've experienced being the first in many spaces, how has that informed your political work today and your vision for the future?
Well, I never thought I would be where I am today. I didn't think that a high school dropout could ever make it to Congress. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and serving is an honor. I want to show an example that if you have a dream and you set your goals and you work hard, you can achieve it. And when I look back at my life, I've had as many failures as I have had successes. I've had second chance after second chance after second chance. And so I don't take anything for granted. And in fact, politically, politicians really frustrate me. I get really pissed off sometimes because people run for office and they say they're going to do one thing, they get elected and they do another. And we just need good people doing good things. I mean, people actually doing the work. And as a conservative, I represent a swing district. I represent not just conservatives. So for me, it's really important that I find common ground, and to find common ground, sometimes you have to find common sense. And so I am informed by the values of my district, which are very diverse. But in doing so, as a conservative in a Congress where we don't have a majority, that if you work hard and you find that common ground, you can be successful. I have passed 16 bills out of committee. I have passed 4 bills out of the floor of the House. And now I have a leadership role on the oversight committee within civil rights, the civil rights space. I'm doing something that I never thought I would be doing. And when you look back at my life, and you can consider going to the Citadel and graduating from there as the first woman, being a civil rights sort of issue, and understanding what that means and how to continue that body of work. And now I have an opportunity to do that. It's really exciting, but I know that if you work hard, you can deliver. And there are a number of different issues that are facing our country. We've had crisis after crisis after crisis, whether we're talking about the border issue, or we're talking about Afghanistan, or we're talking about Ukraine. I've been to the border of Ukraine. Where we're talking about Taiwan. I've been to Taiwan. I met with the president. Or inflation and the cost of goods and what goes into it. In fact, I was talking this morning about diesel fuel and how there's going to be a shortage of that in the not too distant future, and what that's going to mean for produce and going to the grocery store, and how that's going to increase the cost of food. And so, understanding that where I came from informs my work today, because you got to work hard to be successful, and anybody can do it. But that one piece allows you to do that. And I know that we can find common ground. And we've had a devastating and traumatic and horrific events. I was dropping my kids off at school yesterday morning, and there are 19 families in Uvalde that didn't get the opportunity to do that because their kids were murdered. And there's going to be a lot of controversy on that particular issue. How do we keep our students and our kids and our communities and our campuses safe? And I'm looking at the work that I've done in Congress, and I'm looking at the work I did as a state lawmaker. There is common ground, and there is common sense, and there is a way to work together that would unite us rather than divide us. And it's really up to us as Americans to say, time out, stop with the bullshit, stop with the tweets, and what are the ways that we can work together that are constitutionally sound, that don't infringe on anyone's rights, that will actually save lives. And so we've got to take on the toughest of challenges that we have, and we've got to be able to raise our hand and say, let's work together. And that's one of the things I'm most proud about, the ability to be able to raise my hand and put it all out there, take the risk, which means, hey, I've got folks coming after me in my election because of those risks, but that is the right thing to do. And I'm a single working mom, and I know that my kids and my country are worth that much at a minimum because of the challenges that we face today. And so my life experiences have informed that it's always right to do what is right. And I think that was Martin Luther King that said that. And that's what we all should be doing, no matter what our political affiliation or our party politics are. And that's what I aim to continue doing as long as the voters will allow me to do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to tell your story and to chat. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marielle, and look forward to chatting to you guys with you guys soon again.
Thank you, Representative Mace and Marielle, and thank you all for joining us today wherever you are. A special thanks to our presenting sponsors, the Impact Seat Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Girls' Rights Project, the Lumina Foundation, and the Tory Burch Foundation. We appreciate the support of our media partner, USA Today, and our academic partner, Arizona State University, and our community partner, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C. If you liked what you saw today, we hope you'll join the 19th. We're a member-supported newsroom and simply can't put on events like this one without the support of people like you. You can join by donating now at 19thnews.org/membership. You can also support our nonprofit newsroom by signing up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe. Finally, if you missed any part of today's program or you want to rewatch, visit 19thnews.org/summit. That's a wrap for day one of the 19th Represents 2022. We'll see you back here tomorrow, where we'll explore how Title IX led to advances in sports and STEM with WNBA champion Candace Parker, NASA Chief Scientist Kate Calvin, and Nobel laureate Jennifer Doudna. We'll see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.